And there we go. So welcome to this second knowledge sharing session as a part of the Multiphase RTA Consortium. We're really stoked today because we have a pretty cool lineup of presenters. Just remember that before you say something in terms of questions, just remember that you're recorded. So we are recording most of the sessions today. The technical program that's outlined that was also sent in an email yesterday and should also have been in the invite is the following. So I'll do a kind of a quick introduction here to the audience before my friend Jorge from EQT will provide a practical workflow for flat time period analysis. So that's really interesting in basins where a lot of wells are essentially, we call it not choked back, but they have to produce them at a constant rate for a long period of time, and then looking at sensitivities, if you could actually produce them at a higher constant rate versus time with a numerical model. And then Steven is going to take over and kind of end the first session here with basically presenting kind of subsections of our paper that Steven, Trevor Stokes, and I wrote for URTEC about evaluating refracts in Eagle Ford with the multiphase flow material balance technique. Then we'll have a little break, and after that break, Graham will go through some advancements on the nodal side and show you guys how to do some quick nodal calculations in Whitson Plus without having to do any RTA or anything. Like if you just wanted to go in there and start to do nodal calculations, show you how easy that is. And then we're really lucky to have Moeen here with us today to show something called that is abbreviated to DQI, so Devon quantification of interference. I like to kind of call it the CPG 2.0 or the CPG that accounts for kind of fluid compressibility, if you like. I'm sure after this presentation is going to be much clearer for the audience what it is. I'll mention that later as well. It's something we actually have for the roadmap in Whitson Plus later in the year as well. So really excited about learning more for that. And then my colleague Mo, which is also the Whitson COO, he will show something that is, call it not technical, but it's so essential in the software that we figured that we need to spend a little bit of time on it. It's actually some really good feedback from a lot of friends at Devon that our filtering a few months back was really bad or that it actually sucked. So we've updated that a lot, and now it's actually really, really good, and it will even be better in the next release. So Mo will end session 2 with just showing some of that. And again, that's quote unquote not technical, but it's so fundamental for a lot of workflows that we thought it would be nice to highlight. Then the last session is related to a question that starts with Narayan from Coursera. That is a presentation that has been requested by a lot of people. And that's essentially some guidance on how to use the recovery factor analysis that's kind of linked to the multiphase flow material balance module in Whitson Plus. Because a big assumption there, since you're not using relative permeabilities, is essentially to forecast both your CGRs, or I guess implicitly your GORs, and your water gas ratio versus pressure. And how would you do that? How would you sense check that when you're not using a numerical model for that exercise? Then we've done, maybe some of you see it, but we've done a switch between the two last presentations. So Jason is coming in as the 8th presentation there, and he's actually going to show you guys how you can programmatically interface with Whitson Plus through the API. So it's basically going to go through everything from adding a well, setting up the PVT, running the PVT calculation, not in the front end, but from code. So he's going to show the code, then show the front end, go back to the code, show the front end, back to the code for a whole workflow, basically to basically calculate PVT and bottom hole pressures. And that's for the audience, because I know there's a lot of engineers here that would like to do that, and also know that this is a super relevant thing for a lot of the companies or the focal points that do the API integration. So it's a kind of a very good FYI for people who either interface with this directly or will have to work with their colleagues to get this set up. And I know some of you guys is like, yeah, we've done this a long time ago, so that's great, but there's a mix of people in terms of where they are in terms of the onboarding of the API. The absolute last presentation today is a kind of case study, a really detailed case study from the DJ Basin, where Ala is going through a wide range of different workflows on a wide range of wells to basically prove economics in the DJ Basin. What I like about that is kind of something we try to communicate in a lot of the courses and stuff, is to do don't only do one of the workflows. Don't only do multiphase FMB. Don't only do analytical RTA or fractional RTA or numerical RTA. But if you do all of them and see, are they actually pointing in the same direction? That's kind of what you would like to. So we'll round off with that presentation as the last part of session 3. These numbers in terms of time there to the left, they are more guides than anything else. We have set actually 4 hours for this session. We probably won't use the full 4 hours, so please be a little bit, or at least note that these are a little bit of a guide. Awesome. And just for context, some of you guys have never been in a knowledge sharing session before, but this is essentially a part of the Multiphase RTA Consortium that all these companies that's in the call is a part of, where we were already done with the first quarter. That was the last quarter of last year. Then Q1, we had the first knowledge sharing session there that can be accessed through that YouTube link right there. We'll distribute these presentations after the call. And then we have basically to end the second quarter right now, where the main focus has been kind of a multi-phase flow material balance model, and also a multi-well numerical model that we're still working on, that we're really excited about. It's going to be the main R&D focus this quarter. And to end that quarter, we're having the knowledge sharing session today, essentially. And then in the last quarter of the knowledge sharing, of the consortium, we have the so-called WITCON, or the knowledge sharing session 3, that's coming up 12th of October. That is in person in Houston, just like last year. Last year we did it hybrid. I think we'll do it hybrid this year as well. So we were around 50 people in person and 50 online last year. This year I know for sure it will be even bigger. So we're a little bit unsure if we're going to do it a pure in-person thing or a hybrid thing, but let's go for hybrid for now. So if you want more information about WITCON in Houston, 12th of October, it should be the Thursday before ATCE. ATCE is in San Antonio. So if you're planning to come down to Texas for that kind of weekend or whatever, that's kind of why we put it that Thursday. So people are coming in from abroad, or they're coming in for ATCE just from other states and stuff. They can stop by WITCON on Thursday, maybe spend the weekend in Texas. I know there's ACL up in Austin, so maybe you could visit that. Then you're ready to roll in San Antonio on Monday. Also note, just for everybody that's here, you have access to all these half-day courses that we run through the year. They are half-day courses. They're call it hands-on, and they are designed to be a combination of theory and practice. We have 5 different courses that we run every year. The first one was only on PVT and phase behavior in Wits and Pause, already done. We had to break it into 2 sessions just because of the number of people in the sessions. The bottom hole pressure is also in recordings are here, and we had to break that into 2 sessions as well. That's already done, so you can access the recordings here. And then yesterday we finished the RTA course, which is just 4 hours purely on RTA, and we have 2 more sessions coming up, one on flow material balance and one on nodal in the end of September. And that kind of wraps up the whole consortium for this year. And as we've told many of you guys, we're already planning a follow-up consortium. We've gotten a lot of feedback on what to include there on an RTA side of things, so that's already a done deal, and some more information on that is coming in the next month, I think. Awesome. So before we're going to go through to introduce the first speaker today, just wanted to do a couple of things. We're going to go through kind of quickly what we've tried to be doing on the Wits and Plus side. I'll run through kind of the roadmap on the Wits and Plus side. And there is a release. Actually, some of you have been upgraded to that release this week, and we just want to make sure that that's stable before we release it to everyone. So either you'll get it this week, next week, or the week after that. So I'll go through also some of the new exciting things there, just a subsection of it. Of course, we'll get the release notes when your domain has been updated to that release. But as you all know, Whitson Plus, we started the coding there a little bit around 3 years ago right now, and since then we've been super lucky to get to work with all of you, essentially getting close to 80 companies that we work with now, and we've tried to focus on making the software simple, and that is simple in every single term of at least when it comes to interfacing with us. It should be one product, so we don't modularize the product. It has every single feature that we're developing as a part of the product right now, and all the future modules that we're planning on implementing. It's also one price for unlimited number of users. It's one interface, such that you can seamlessly integrate your workflow in one interface. That's kind of where it started. That we did a lot of project. I remember my first project up in the Bakken was like 12 walls there. You spent 3 months of doing it, and I had to spin up like 5 softwares on my computer from different vendors and stuff. It was a nightmare. So we kind of tried to solve some of those problems. And we also focus on having single sign-on, such that it's really easy for you to just go into a web page, log in like you log into your email, and you're off to the races. The last thing I'll just mention, and that's a reminder for many of you, because I see the participation list that a lot of you guys are really active, but our support is always available. And when I say always, I say always. So just shoot us an email at support@whitson.com. And on average, the response time is 2 minutes on the support ticket. And depending, of course, on the nature of the ticket, we're there to help you whenever. And it's also really easy for you to jump on a call with us if needed. As I mentioned later, we'll have a presentation by Jason. It's going to talk about the API integration, and the API integration is one of 2 different cloud integrations that we offer. So you have the API integration, which allows for really flexible third-party integration. And if you, especially for companies with a lot of data and you need to transfer a lot of data, a more kind of direct database connection might be required. So that's what we typically see in general. So we also have a so-called snowflake share connection. So in short, this is 2 different alleys to get to the same answer, which is automatically having all the production data and all the wellbore data connected to Whitson Plus, so that you can get bottom hole pressure calculations, for instance, and PVT, etc., run every single day automatically. And probably the most popular workflow there that Jason is going to showcase is this workflow right here, where you integrate production data and wellbore data from a database with the cloud integration of choice to calculate bottom hole pressures on every single day. So you can literally go into a web page and you see the bottom hole pressures calculated until yesterday, every single day. So that's something that is probably the most popular workflow from the integration perspective as of right now. So that's on the API side. In the call today, if you have never heard about RTA stuff before, we're gonna have presentations on numerical models. We're gonna put presentations talking about like fractional RTA, classical RTA. We're gonna have the presentation with Steven about multiphase FMB. So all of you guys that have not done a lot of this work before needs to know a few basics about RTA before understanding what they're going to go through. And I'm going to go through that super fast, less than 3 minutes. And it's kind of related to these 3 new technologies that was developed the last 3 years. It's numerical RTA, multiphase flow material balance, and fractional RTA. Numerical RTA from Apache with Braden, multiphase flow material balance from Cortera with Leslie and Barry, and fractional RTA from Chevron with Jorge. So just before going into the details there, we're just going to go into these 3 things in a nutshell, just 1 slide per topic. And very important for you, if you've never done RTA before, there's 2 slides on RTA that you need to remember. The first one is related to the flow regimes, where the first flow regime bucket is infinite acting flow, and that ends as a pressure transient reaches one of the reservoir boundaries. And the second kind of extreme to that is boundary dominated flow that starts as a pressure propagation and reached all of the reservoir boundaries. And in between there, we're dealing with what we call transitional flow. So we've seen one of the reservoir boundaries, but not all of them. So that's the flow regimes. Once you've kind of bucketed your well into one of these flow regimes, or maybe it sees many different flow regimes over time, you can use RTA as a technique to essentially get 2 different parameters out from an RTA workflow. And that's these 2 bulk parameters that we call A root K and the contacted pore volume. Some people also call it the SRV. Okay, and the first thing you can derive from RTA is your A root K. Some people call it the LFP. So if you hear that in the presentation today, linear flow parameter or LFP is the same as A root K. Okay, we say that that typically correlates with short-term production. And then the second thing is the contacted pore volume. The contacted pore volume is something that correlates with EURs in general. And why is that? Well, that number right there multiplied with the recovery factor is the definition of yield. Just remember that A root K, you can only quantify that if you observe infinite acting linear flow, at least rigorously. And contacted pore volume, rigorously, you can only quantify that when you observe boundary dominated flow. So with this, to put this into kind of a practical picture, a high IP and a high EUR means high LFP and high OIP. If you have a low LFP and a low LFP and a high OIP will be down here, so you can have a high EUR but a low IP. The small completion will be down there, and probably an overstimulated rock will be up to the left. And here, when we talk about IPs, we typically talk about that as short-term production. So numerical RTA is just one slide on that, where a flat horizontal line indicates infinite acting linear flow. A deviation below this line represents boundary dominated or transitional flow, and the magnitude of the line itself indicates the LFP. And this is from the work from Braden a few years ago. When it comes from multiphase flow material balance, that's a method that does not require rel perms. It outputs the contacted pore volume and does not care about geometry. But like with any flow material balance method, you assume boundary dominated flow or pseudo-steady state. So if you're still infinite acting or transitional, this would be kind of a lower estimate of your contacted pore volume. So you can use it to bound your RTA work. The diagnostic plot is super simple. It's a straight line on a plot like this. The inverse of that slope is your contacted pore volume. So this is a small OIP, this is a big OIP, and this is a bigger OIP. Fractional RTA is the last thing that you'll probably hear about. It kind of uses, this is one of the key diagnostic plots from Jorge. Basically fits a power law function, or power law function through the data right here, and that's just rate normalized pressure versus time. And you get this delta parameter out here. That delta parameter is a number between 0.5 and 0. If it's 0.5, you're dealing with infinite acting linear flow. If it's 0, you deal with boundary dominated flow. And if you have a delta in between there, you're dealing with transitional. So that's that. So you have a few of the basics before the presentations start. In terms of the roadmap going forward right now, the release that we have been working on now has a lot of upgrades related to performance. You'll see that in the release notes. We've also had a lot of upgrades related to the decline and type hole functionality, and also on the production engineering functionality. So there's also a lot of nodal analysis work that's coming in to the software really, really soon. On the well testing, we're done with this chow pressure group feature. We're currently working on the DFIT feature, and as soon as we're done with that, we're going to go into implementing the DQI functionality that Moin is going to talk about. And on the multi-well front, we're, at least on the theory part, done with the flow material balance for multi-well, and implementing that right now. And we're also working on and gotten pretty far on the multi-well numerical model as well. So that should be out here pretty soon. The new release, as the last thing, what is kind of some of the highlights in the new release? And I know how you guys are thinking. Basically, this, the release date. You have a tester like myself. I'm like, that's a bug, and then I go to the developer, and they're like, no, that's a feature. So that happens a lot. But in general, when it comes to some of the highlights, then I'm just running through a sub part of it. But in Nodal, we now have a gas IPR option. Maybe Graham will talk a little bit more about that. In a numerical model, we have an option now to forecast on wellhead pressures, so you can basically generate tubing tables, which is huge. We're really happy with that. The bottom hole pressure engine now has an option for injection processes. So for all of you who have talked about or requested that, whether that's for CO2 or I guess nitrogen or any type of gas, or for just water disposal wells, you have that available now with a simple toggle in the software. So let me know if you need any info on that. Silent side BHP calculation is also in the software right now, where you can in a very simple drop-down menu pick to use the silent side for a BHP calculation. You can also bulk run and export all the BHP calculations now in an Excel file, which is something a lot of you have requested. Derivatives are included in the analytical RTA feature. So you can actually pick between different types of derivatives. For day as the default, you can also use weighted central difference, etc. So you can just toggle it on and use that as an additional flow regime diagnostics. So really nice from that perspective. In shower pressure group, we've upgraded such that the Bordier derivative is the default, with a lot of help from our friends from Crescent Point and Chevron. So that's been really good. We've also included the pressure integral based on some feedback from essentially a few engineers at Quantum Energy Partners there, where it's kind of similar when you do numerical RTA, when you flip between using instantaneous LFPs and cumulative LFPs. It's just a way to remove noise if you have a lot of noise. In the diagnostic plot, you will have an option to plot 4 plots instead of just only 1. So you can kind of create a dashboard of 4 plots from the different templates. For those who are running the separator shrinkage calculation and basically inputting separator rates and converting them to stock tank, that calculation takes a little bit of time if you have a lot of data. So I think earlier, if you had 1,000 days, it would take like 20 seconds or so. And now with the new upgrade, it should take 2-3 seconds. So we're really stoked about that. Mo is going to go through the advanced filtering and sorting. And in general, there's a huge performance upgrade. For instance, we have integrated something called WebGL. So like the plots now can take like a 10x or maybe 100x number of data points without any problems in the software. So if you have well test data, for instance, with very high frequency, the software can eat that up. And there's of course a lot more. But with that, I realized I've talked way too much, as I usually do, and I would like to introduce the next speaker. Jorge, are you there with us?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. And you can just go ahead and share the screen, and I'll turn off my camera and my microphone, and we should be off to the races.
All right, let's share my screen. You guys see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, so good morning, everyone. And just want to have 2 disclaimers. The first one is that I have like a very few slides, and the second one is a very simple approach. But I want to quote someone that was very famous. That he said, like, if you cannot explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So that's my goal today. Like with very simple stuff, I'll try to explain what we're trying to do over here in EQT. And before I start, I want to thank Jason, Matthias, and Mo on all his effort to helping us to get the tool set up with the API connections and all the bulk uploads. So thank you guys. Right, so the title changed a little bit. It's a practical workflow for choke management IPs analysis. I was told that flat time period was not a term that is most used for, or it's common in the industry. So this is more familiar to you guys, choke management IPs analysis. So what's our outline? So what motivated us to start doing this analysis and use Whitson as a proxy or a tool to commence with that? Then I'll give you a little bit of background on what was the problem, and then the workflow, how we managed to solve it and how we are trying to do it efficiently, and then some execute exercise and what's the future work that we have planned. And also I was told by my colleagues at EQT that if someone doesn't know what EQT does, here's an EQT in a nutshell. So we are the #1 producer of natural gas in the United States, and if we were a country, we were the 12th largest producer in the world. So mostly we are in the Southwest Pennsylvania Marcellus shale, and we are also doing Northeast Pennsylvania Marcellus, but mostly Southwest Pennsylvania and West Virginia. So what was the motivation? What started for us to create this workflow and start analyzing the choke management and IP? So essentially, we are saying that, as Matthias explained earlier, like we have to constrain most of our production to the capacity. So we have to do some flat time periods, not like in Eagle 4 on another place that you produce from the peak and then you start declining. Here we start like with a flat time period, and then from there we that's based on the capacity, and since it's gas, we have to constrain it, and then most of it is because of the infrastructure. And the reasons that we're trying to apply the numerical simulation was to how we can impact that IP change. Is it going to be constrained, or is it going to be higher? What can we do, and how we can achieve it faster? Then we used to have some models, statistical and empirical, that perhaps we're doing a good job, but we as engineers do like things that are physics-based. So we want to do approaches like that. And then that continued to understand with a physics-based approach, how was the impact plus minus percentage of change. And then lastly, it's like Whitson is a big help because it's easy to use, friendly, and also you can do it faster. So the background is like, this is an example of how a dry gas at EQT well looks like. So in the red is the gas rate, the black is the bottom hole pressure, and the blue one is the water. So essentially, you can detect there, like with a little bit of noise, but based on the performance, you see a kind of a flat time period, a plateau over there, and then you start seeing a decline at some point. And then obviously your pressure starts becoming like your bottom hole pressure declines, and then you have to have some constraints with the line pressure. That's when you produce the well at that decline, and then you can have more data over there. And essentially, if you think of how to forecast these wells, it's not as it could be with a statistical approach, but like, what if we change the IPs? What if we constrain it to lower? Or we have a good price, what if we increase the IPs, and how will the pressure will manage? So here are my constraints, like the line pressure is one constraint, and also like how will my rate will decline based on the problem. So the question is, what if we change the initial production rate? So the workflow is like, we want to change it, but how do we change it? So essentially, we're using all the features in Whitson. Obviously, we try to do a classic RTA to get an idea on how the well is performing in terms of classical RTA. Then we use the same workflow to do the numerical RTA. We come up and match on our best kind of effort to match the well. And once we have a history match that it looks reasonable on both, and normally we do first by pressure, and then we do by rate. And then once we have like a decent match, and we are kind of okay with the results, we can then forecast it, right? So that's kind of the workflow there, which is easy. And I apologies if this seems to be very, very obvious to anyone in the audience, but the workflow is like this. And what's next? Like how you will ask, like, how, Jorge, this is something very, very obvious for me, but how do you use it? Essentially, the second step, once we have this workflow, which seems to be very practical to any well, we do delete most of the data, because you already have the matching parameters. So once you have the matching parameters, which is the important part, and then you did a history match, which looked decent, and then you're okay with the forecast, then you can use those history match parameters, which is essentially what you do in numerical simulation. Either you are thinking in numerical simulation for a very powerful tool like the ones that we have used, or I'm going to say this is also powerful, but it's practical. It's fast, and you don't have to go by using a lot of clusters or a lot of high performance computers. So we delete most of the data, and we just end up having the very early stage just to have kind of something to start with when we change the IPs. So once we delete that data, and when we constrain what's going to be the new IPs, the model by itself and the calculations will be very straightforward. So the model now says, okay, now you're giving me an IP that is higher or lower than the one that you gave me earlier. But since I don't know what's the data, I'm going to give you a pressure performance, and then I'm going to give you the forecast based on that. And what we're trying to achieve is not essentially the forecast, because obviously we are aiming to have the same EOR, because we're not changing anything to the reservoir, or a little bit of detriment at the end. That's something that we can discuss within another hour or two. But we are aiming to say, what's the impact? How did that change the time when you hit the line pressure and then you start declining your gas rate. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So the workflow goes like this really fast. We delete the data and we end up having only this portion that it's marked in the pink box. And once we have that portion, we use the history match parameters and constrain the well with a new IP on the future that Whitson has also available. So once we are able to do that, we start doing some scenarios, and then what we end up having there, this is an execute exercise based on the well that I show you. You can have as many scenarios as you want, and this is really fast. I mean, you don't have to spend more than an hour doing this. It's very simple and very practical. And essentially what we are trying to analyze in this specific one was what was the time when we reached the line pressure, like at what time and at what point we're reaching that line pressure and the well starts declining. So we know how long that the plateau will last. And this exercise will tell us that impact, the percent of change, and everything will be physics-based. And how we can validate this? Well, if you ask me, the validation is already in the model because you're using a physics-based model, but you have to make everyone's happy. So we validated, or I will not say validated, we compared to the other methods that we have been using, like the statistical one or the empirical one. And both methods agree, but I will say that this is the strongest one because the statistical could be kind of faded by some other data or bad data. And you can end up having like, I mean, it's a statistical. So if you use the average, that's okay, but sometimes the average won't tell us a thing. And if you're not using the correct parameters in statistics, you may end up having like a failure in terms of a decision or over or underestimating something. So it's good to have methods to compare with and say, hey, perhaps we're doing something that we could achieve. And then the practical method can be improved with this statistical approach, and also the numerical approach can validate it as well. Once we constrain that, we end up having the conclusions like what was the time, what was the change, and then we can decide on the type curve build, like how we are gonna go through that. So this also helps to the type curve construction. And essentially over here, I'm just saying that the scenario A is the highest IP that we can get from that reservoir. So if you think of this as kind of doing a nodal analysis, when you do the IPR plot, when you do the bottom hole pressure against the rate, but in this case, you are doing it using the history match parameters from RTA, and then you're using a model quickly. So it's essentially the same story, but now you know how long will that IP will last on your model. And I think that's it in a nutshell. I hope everyone enjoy, and I just have like a very, very small remark. So this is a simple workflow, and I continue to say simple because again, I don't want to say that this is something that's a breakthrough, and I have seen very interesting papers in your text, so this is nothing compared with. It can be easily applied. The method also, it's able to help us to in the construction of type curves, and it's a way to compare methods within our workflow, and it's very, very simple to implement. So, and it is not fast. The most expensive part, as I can say here, is that the history match. So the history match is something that everyone enjoys doing, especially the reservoir engineers. And essentially, if you are doing the history match and you want to be very, very careful on what you do, that's I would say the most expensive part. But if you do it like properly and then you get used to the well performance in other sections of the same area, then I guess you become more and more kind of practical in the sense of doing the history match for well. And once we're done, this is not limited to only history match. So because there are features also in Whitson that you can apply, and simply if you don't have any data, you can just create a well from scratch and have the same exercise here. And I think they also have features in the sensitivity portion that you can even create your own type curve, bottom hole pressure performance, and then you can have also some rate constraints there. But other than that, I appreciate the invitation, and I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation.
Awesome, appreciate it a lot. This this is super relevant. I think that's the most important thing. It's the steps are call it straightforward, but getting a good history match and stuff is not always easy, and it's also super relevant for a lot of the other basins. We've seen a lot of this stuff in parts of the Bakken, all the places where you're constrained on some kind of, whether that's gas processing power or whether it's oil or anything else. So that's really cool, and also seeing that being incorporated into type curves and stuff is bread and butter for people on every single day, right? Creating type walls. In terms of questions, there was no particular questions that I saw here in the chat. Just in terms of like next things for you in general when it comes to using these models going forward, are you foreseeing to updating these models frequently, or are you more planning to just validate the models that you have, the history matched models that you have, versus new historical data that comes in? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so essentially this first workflow and test on this exercise was meant to understand the kind of the analogs and see how the IP's changes will help us to build better type curves, or like estimate better the type curves in the area. Because we were thinking on, okay, this well that it's selected by as an analog, we can say it behaves like this, but what if we increase the rate because we have some capacity that could take more gas? And that's why we say, hey, how much gas we will take and how long that plateau will last, to be aware of the other areas. So it's kind of like helping us to build the type curves in that end.
Yeah, the one thing every time we talk about kind of sensitivities on, I guess, implicitly this is kind of sensitivities on drawdown scenarios, and I think Austin has a great question in the chat here, and I don't think you touched upon it. Would you expect like different EURs for the different drawdown scenarios here? That's a big thing for condensates, for instance, that depending on your drawdown strategy, you can lose condensate and whatnot. These are dry gas wells. Have you ever looked at things like this?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it also kind of made the debate over here internally. But a short answer will say no, because my goal is to aim at least to have the same EOR, and then what I'm trying to achieve is that in a short period. So I'm not forecasting them to 50 years. And yeah, you will see probably a very low detriment if you kind of ask for more rate at the beginning, and then you will have a little bit of detriment, but it's not as impacting as much as I will say in our exercise, because it's just single phase at this point.
Yeah, no, exactly, and I think that's been my experience as well, that for dry gases and also really low GOR oils, there's really little sensitivity to that. Curtis, you have a question there?
Yeah, well, hey, it's a really interesting presentation, and growing up in the business with dry gas, and Mike Petkovich basically saying, if you understand dry gas, then you can then go on and understand the more complicated systems. What I'm curious about is, have you thought about trying to use the history match models to do like compressor optimization, compressor design, either for single well or multi-well systems? I don't know how low your tubing pressures. I think you didn't actually show pressures on the slides.
Yeah, that's actually another step for us to try, because for now we are just trying on rates, and kind of that's the most practical one. We can say what happened to the rate and how the pressure will behave. But yeah, the second step will be, if we have the pressure or the constraint on pressure, like how will we deal with that one? And that's, I would say, the second step. But yeah, that's very interesting. We haven't looked at it, but thank you for asking, Dr. Whitson.
Sweet.
Thanks.
We'll round up there, but really appreciated, sir. Great presentation, and looking forward to working with you all in the future as well. It's been really pushing us a lot on the API front to make sure it's getting developed fast and stuff as well. So that's awesome. So thank you guys for that. Next up here is my co-author and good friend Stephen Young. Is going to present some of our work on the multiphase FMB and using that to evaluate refracts. While he's getting started with his presentation, I'm going to introduce kind of the topic a little bit more, Stephen. I saw Manuel has a question in the chat here about the topic of numerical simulation. Any estimated time of arrival on the optimizer to accelerate the history matching process? And yeah, it's getting higher and higher on the priority list, Manuel. So hopefully here in the next few months we'll have a V1 up. So that's at least the goal internally. And the more people who ask that question, by the way, the higher on the priority list it comes. So it sounds good. Stephen, so Stephen is with Devon Energy. He's been there for a decade now, plus or minus. Is the main author on this paper together with Trevor. Where we evaluated a bunch of refracts in the Eagle Ford with the multiphase FMB method, and we actually wrote a paper for RTIC about it. So with that, Stephen, I'll just give the floor to you.
Perfect. I assume you can hear me and see the slides and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So I'll just go ahead and jump on in. So yeah, I'm Stephen Young, so I'm the asset supervisor of our Mid-Continent asset. But today going to be talking about a lot of the work that primarily Trevor Stokes did in our Eagleford asset, trying to analyze our refracts, where we've had a pretty large program down there historically with some pretty great results, but trying to be able to get to understand how successful they were earlier in time, just so that way we can accelerate all of our decision process on, if that was the right decision or not, or should we have drilled an infill well, or just how good were they when we were changing up different designs. So stole some of the ERTEC slides that were presented by Matthias here in Denver, has unfortunately had a family conflict, so I couldn't make it, but significantly edited the presentation. So hopefully it'll at least look a little bit different, even if you did attend that, as well as look different, even if you've seen me talk about this topic before. But we'll jump right into it. So kind of hit on it a minute ago. So the purpose of this was to see if we could tie any early time performance indicators to the long-term EUR uplift. This tended to be particularly difficult with the refracts, just because there is so much changing with refracts. It's even more complex than just a new well that you're bringing online. Typical ARPS parameters, extra struggle to deal with it, as you're dealing with not only brand new contacted rock, as we see close to virgin pressure. We know we're accessing a lot of new rock, a lot of new reserves with most of these jobs, with a lot of the science work we've done. If people are familiar with the HFTS project that we did in the Eagleford, this is that area, as well as a lot of the other work that we've done on just having a lot of these in the ground, seeing significant incremental production as opposed to just acceleration. And in the end, after going back and doing some analysis, I presented something that looks similar to this maybe a year ago, and we had done a couple wells and just starting to look at it and said, hey, these couple that we looked at actually seem like they might make sense. So since then, we've analyzed a lot more, added it all into a big database, and are actually seeing, it wasn't just those couple wells that are actually making sense. That this methodology really is starting to show that we can get a pretty good trend to within, our goal was 30 days. Even within 15 days, we were able to give a pretty good answer as what we think that EUR uplift was going to be. On the bottom plot is just a rate time. You can see one example of a refract done. It's not pretty in the slightest bit. I'm just throwing exponential lines through it. But you can kind of see here, 2,700 days, there's a bit of a bend that, really just wouldn't hit typical ARPS parameters. We see some very steep declines early on, then some choke bumps, and then it just starts flattening. And that's just because all the different pressures that we're connected into can start feeding in at different times easier. And it really makes it complicated when trying to use typical ARPS parameters. And so if you just threw a decline on these wells early on, even with some of your more conventional B factors that you think would work for the Eagleford in general, it just doesn't seem to match the refract as well. So that's why we jumped into what we were doing. I apologize. Some of these are Matthias's slides, and he loves animations, so I'm gonna have to click a lot. So the first thing we did and with the help from the guys at Whitson, was say, hey, let's make a simulated case, super easy, super quick. Make sure that what we're seeing in those first two examples that we had done about a year ago actually made sense, or is what we're seeing just a complete artifact and it was better lucky than good. So built up a quick model, threw in some new fractures. You can see what it looks like, primary depletion, do a refract, bring the well back online, what kind of rate, what kind of uplift do we get, send it out to, drop out the oil rate, make sure we're getting the uplift we wanted, and then send it to Multiphase FMB to see what the uplift in the OOIP contacted is and see what that multiplier ratio is. So with the work that was done there, we force coded in that we would get 2 times greater contacted OOIP after the refract, threw it into Multiphase FMB to make sure that it's actually coming through in the equations and makes sense. Obviously, the Multiphase FMB workflow being very different than the models without having to use rel perms and all of that good stuff. And unsurprisingly, though, it does come out exactly as you would expect in a case that we force coded in there. That yes, when we have double the OIP contacted, yes, the simulated case said that we would double it in Multiphase FMB. And the uplift in oil was in line with what the expectations would have been. So happy with that. Life was good. So jumping into the true Eagleford, so here's just a quick look at all the PVT throughout Whitson that was used in some of the background. And then click through the Multiphase FMB plots super quickly. I'm frankly going to largely ignore sections 2 and 3 for the purpose of this paper and the work that was done, because once we get past them, section number 1 being where you are still above bubble point. We're fortunate here in the Eagleford, we have a lot of headroom above bubble point. We're a pretty volatile oil, but significantly overpressured. So we do get a nice period of time where we are above that bubble point and can actually see a large OOIP. 2 being that transition while you're still building your boundaries, still seeing further and further into the reservoir once you do pass bubble point pressure. And then 3 being true, boundary dominated when you've seen the full tank. What we really care about for this workflow and trying to use this as an early time indicator for a read through to long term was just this first section. If we had to wait until we had seen all of our boundaries, go all the way past that section 3, then the workflow is no help to us, because by the time the well's been online for a year and a half, well, what the EUR is well enough anyways, and DCA can play decent enough. So we're really focusing on that early time period 1, where we're still above saturation pressure. So I'm going to skip all of the section 2 and 3, because frankly, I don't really care about them. I will stop really fast and talk about kind of the difference in the OIPs that you see, because we do pay some attention to the early and late OIPs for our workflows, which is why some of this is really interesting. Typically, the normal thing you see in most plays is more along the lines of, option number 1 here, maybe option 2 if you're lucky and you're above bubble point pressure and in a black oil system. But typically what you see is that early OIP doesn't see the full tank because you haven't seen all your boundaries. I'm sure Matthias has talked about that ad nauseum. What is very different in the Eagleford is we are very much option 3. So we have a significant loss of surface area with time based on the fact that we have very strong geomechanical properties and pressure dependent perm that is then massively shrinking our SRVs. One of the reasons that we think refracts have been so successful here in the Eagleford is that we have, even though we create initial large hydraulic fracture stimulation, as good as we can make that, we still know that our pressure dependent perm properties are going to close some of that back off to us. And so we're able to reopen a lot of that, create brand new fractures that can then get that oil that could not flow. So this is that exact example. So early time, I have it circled down here just so you can see the difference in time. Very, very big difference. It's filtered down to 600 material balance days on the first plot and 50,000 on the second plot. So very different axes that we're looking at. And you could pick the first slope at, we're contacting maybe 2 million barrels of OIP when these wells first come online above bubble point. And by the time you get through, passing through bubble point and can see all your boundaries and you get back to that more stabilized flow regime again, we're down to 600. So pretty significant degradation and contacted OIP. That's not really the normal thing for what you would see. I'm hitting on that a little bit more, even though I say it's irrelevant for what we're interested in, because that is what's of interest for the next phases of what this project could be, is using it more as an identifier of how do we pick a good candidate, as opposed to just looking back after we've completed a refrac and then saying, how good was it? If we could better predict, hey, these wells lost X amount of OIP that we could go back and contact, that would be, the holy grail for being able to make this a much more successful program, is being able to pick the right candidates. So I did want to hit on that, even though we don't have any answers today. It's always a interesting thing to say, hey, there is more in the hopper here, more we can do with the data now that we're starting to validate that this data actually does correlate to our longer term performance. So here's an example of a successful refrac we've done. On the far left side is the DCA. Obviously, we have a lot of data now. We're cool with being able to just throw some more DCA ARBS parameters on it and can say, okay, before the refrac, it was a 300 MBO well. After the refrac, just shy of 600 MBO. So about a doubling in the EUR. So very, very successful refrac, very happy with the results there. And this is not hugely out of line with kind of some of the things we see in our refrac program. And so here are the comparisons, once again, dealing with, 1,000 material balance days here, mainly because we had to scale to see the refrac, all the way up to, 16, 20,000 on the late time comparison. But what we're seeing is that change in OIP from early time in when the well first came online to early time after the refrac. So there's about 20 days of highlighted data here in the blue dots that we're using to forecast through. So probably could have done it even decently earlier. This is not the cleanest example, but able to very quickly say, hey, with only 15 days of data, we're seeing about a 2x increase in OIP from what we saw early time on the first time the well came online. And hey, that looks like it will correlate in the end to the actual performance increase. Just a slightly higher number that we can then ratchet back based on the data set we have. Same story in late time, which is good to see that everything's correlating the way you would expect, which could then help, makes us feel better about our ability to use it as a predictor going forward as well, that it does seem like it's keeping that same percentage of the SRV somewhat intact. So similar 2x increase. I also think it's important just to show a refrac that didn't work, because that does happen at times. And so making sure this methodology works for those as well. And it did nicely. So we did another refrac here, see a very nice increase in production rate. Unfortunately, I covered it up with these little boxes, but it declined off steeply. And this one didn't flatten out like the other ones had and kind of fall over nearly as quickly. It waited back until it was closer to the rate we were before, which thus resulted in a very small increase in early time OIP, very small increase in late time OIP. That's all still trending and very much fits in line with what we saw in the true results. So felt good that that was a successful predictor. So kind of wrapping everything up, making sure, kind of how does the program success in general. Here's a quick look at 29 refracs that we rolled up into part of this database. Looking at both the early slopes, late slopes, you can see that 80% uplift as far as the average goes is holding true. So it felt nice that everything is making sense when you're looking at a much bigger data set and bringing it all together. And then here's kind of the same story of, hey, how much is that early slope? So that data that we're identifying in the first 15 days, how much is that increasing versus how much is our oil EUR increasing? And while it's not the perfect one-to-one correlation, which we did not necessarily expect, it is a very nice correlation that now that you have it, you could use, hey, if I see about a 100% increase in my slope, you should expect that you're going to get about a 75-80% increase in your actual EUR. So now we have that trend that we can use pretty quickly to be able to help quantify that uplift. And that does vary as you move around. There's some things that are changing with how we did these jobs that did allow for some filtering and actually some further analysis in the data, which was pretty cool. So in summary, at the end of the day, we were pretty excited that we were able to not only get to that 30 days where we could feel pretty good about the uplift, but even faster than that, looking more to 15 days to be able to give a pretty good thumbs up, thumbs down on the success and any changes we made, if they were the right or not. Multiphase FMB is working very much as we were hoping it would and expecting it would. And at the end of the day, the biggest thing we really cared about is obviously we're making money out here. We are able to quantify that we are adding reserves, not just accelerating, and when it is that that's happening or not. As I showed, that does happen sometimes. But for the most overwhelming majority of time, we're contacting a lot of new rock and able to quantify that pretty quickly, that it's not just the acceleration. So yeah, that is it. I think I hit right on the time slot. But happy taking questions if anybody had anything come through. Other than that, I appreciate the time.
Awesome, sir. Very good. Thank you so much. I see we have a few questions there, so I'll probably start with the questions from the audience, and then I have some questions as well. But Stephen from Marathon, would you like to get started?
Yeah, great presentation. Real quick, do you ever clip out the refract portion separately, or do you analyze the FMB all together with the original frac?
Yeah, so that historically we always clipped it out separately. That was back when we were looking at more of a root K kind of basis. So it was a lot nicer to just reinitialize everything and look at just post refrac. I'd say that had good success, not great success. And that is something we're thinking about on the back end of, hey, maybe it would have made more sense to reinitialize and doing this exact same workflow. But we had not done that yet when we were putting this together.
When you clip out, or if y'all are going to clip out going forward, what would you utilize for the initial reservoir pressure? Just maybe the first PWF measured after the refract?
Yeah, and I will say we get when we bring these wells back online, we get pretty darn close to the initial PWF we saw the first time, which correlates pretty well to what we've seen as far as reservoir pressure mapping that we expected. And that's just because we know we're contacting pretty darn new rock here. So that is one issue you would have, is obviously how do you when you reinitialize, what pressure do you want to go to? So yes, the short answer would be probably stick with PWF, but I would expect that to be within 10% of original reservoir pressure also.
Maybe a similar question for the saturation. I know you're probably still thinking through how y'all are going to reinitialize, but maybe just throw out, what would you think about the saturation too?
Yeah, that's another good one. I'll say we are so massively sub-irreducible here that we see incredibly little water production. So I think, frankly, our saturation ratios are probably not that crazy different than even they were to begin off of, because there just is not much water left in this portion of the Eagle Ford. So I probably would end up just leaving those close to defaults as well. But it is, once again, another thing that is on our mind. How would we do that?
Yeah, all good. Hey, I appreciate it. Great presentation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. And I just a couple of comments on that as well, because I've actually done that exercise fairly recently, where if at least in the multiphase FMB method, if you took splitted essentially the data set into a post refrac and a pre refrac portion, and try to do the same workflow, you'll actually, and you compare that to like a simulated model, you'll actually get a little bit the lower estimated uplift than what's the true uplift is. So at least from the flow material balance method, if you're going to use that to use all the data in one time series, is really important. So we have some more questions here, Stephen. So maybe my questions will not come through. But Saul has a comment here. Do you run into any challenges for the legacy wells in terms of having not having data such as fluid levels for rod pumps, etc.?
Certainly. What I'd say is this data, we're pretty overpressured. None of this goes to rod pump. We're entirely gas lift. So we are, not that you should have a ton of confidence in your bottom hole pressure calculations playing in the gas lift world. But we do have, the ability to take a swag at what valve we're on and be able to calculate pressures. That is one plus here of, because we're so overpressured, wells naturally flow even up casing, not even up tubing right off the bat. We've ran quite a few flowing bottom hole pressure surveys to feel good about what correlations we're using to calculate bottom hole pressure. And because I'm only looking at the first 15 days of flowback, I still have a ton of pressure where I'm not worried about liquid loading and having big issues in my calculations. Frankly, pretty much all the major pressure drop correlations largely stack up on top of each other that early on in the life of the wells. So that definitely simplifies things here.
Yeah, awesome. And then do you have any comments on using like synthetic models to help with the evaluation of potential refracts, especially thinking about expected rates? And that's Saul's question, and it kind of ties into Zamir's questions as well there. If you have any thoughts on if you can like estimate initial rates post a refract, if you have thought any about that, or maybe that's the next step.
Yeah, there's definitely more we could do there. What I'd say is, once again, similarly being massively over pressure, it really comes down to how we want to draw these wells down. We could bring it on at incredibly high rates if we wanted to go to wide open chokes, but we typically are more in the 24 to 34, 64s kind of chokes. So we're really managing that drawdown more so than, the IPs are largely dependent more on us than they are on the rock. That's probably the better way to say that. So it's certainly something we could play with more, but usually it's based on how we want to flow them back.
Awesome, excellent. This is perfect, sir. We'll stop it there. We'll take a break. We'll be back at 9:15 Houston time, 8:15 Mountain time, and we'll get started with the next session. Sounds great. Thank you so much, Stephen.
And thank you, guys.
Okie doke. So we'll go ahead and get started again. So typical Matthias fashion, we're 15 minutes behind the schedule, but we on purpose I added another hour there, so we should be good. Next up is my great colleague Graham Helfrich, and I'll leave the floor to you, Graham. No further introduction needed, but the title is Quick Nodal in Whitson Plus, but I'm sure the title has changed a little.
Absolutely. Can you hear me and see my my toaster picture here, Matthias?
Yeah, perfect. Beautiful toaster.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a nightmare because I have toast every day, and you know, it has to be really simple. So I'm kind of worried. You know, I come down the stairs, I see this monstrosity in front of me, and you know, first I try to burn my toast, and then I'm like, I have to put the toast through 3 times until I figure it out. And the problem with this is, again, something that I do every day, I need it to be really simple. And when we're talking about production engineers, you know, IPR curves and tubing performance curves, those are things that production engineers are doing every day, and they need to be very, very simple. So what I wanted to show today in Whitson Plus is how quickly someone can do an IPR tubing performance curve, some quick optimization sensitivities, super, super fast without doing any RTA work. Okay, so we're gonna do it live here. So we're gonna basically add a well. Again, this is a well with no history. We're gonna go directly to nodal analysis. Okay, and we basically need to create our Vogel or our oil IPR curve here. So we put in the current rate that the well's operating at, the current GOR, current flowing pressure, whatever the current water oil ratio is here. The current reservoir pressure. Now, if you know, if the production engineer doesn't know the current reservoir pressure, that's where, you know, if you as a reservoir engineer have done the flowing material balance, we could get that number right there, and then our bubble point or saturation pressure here. Okay, so right away we get our IPR curve, right? This is our average reservoir pressure. This is kind of our test drawdown point that we're at now, and then this is our bubble point pressure. So that's how quick it is to get the IPR generated. Next thing we want to do is kind of look at our current operating condition for outflow, meaning the tubing performance curve, or we call it the VLP. So again, this is a well we've created from scratch. I did not import any wellbore data. I did not import any history. And so if we go to the bottom well pressure tab, we'll see that there's some defaults entered here just to get us started. So the default assumes that we have 7,000 feet TVD, and then another 5,000 feet for lateral. So you're totally welcome to modify this to paste your deviation survey in, but there's something there just to get you started. What size tubing are we assuming? Well, in this case, we're assuming 2 7/8. Go ahead and modify it if you want, but there's something there just to get started right away. So this particular well is naturally flowing right now. So we're going to put in a wellhead pressure of 1,500 pounds, and then we can create this VLP curve. Okay, so we see this is our current operating point that we're at right now. Great. Now I see that there's a lot of room here to the right in terms of liquid rate that we could maybe attain if we did some different optimization scenarios. But for now, I'm just going to say current rate 1,500 psi wellhead pressure. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is say, what if I were to reduce the wellhead pressure down to 500 pounds? We'll create that VLP, and we can see kind of the before and after, and what that incremental rate would be if we did that. So I'm going to save this. That's kind of my 500 psi VLP. We see the legends kind of being updated. Great. Now let's go ahead and try doing some gas lift. How would that work? So we're going to go ahead and change our artificial lift to gas lift. I'm going to keep it really simple with pour boy gas lift for now. So all the injected gas is coming right up from the end of tubing. And maybe we'll start with only 300 MCF for gas lift rate. Okay, so basically we see natural flow, and then with a little bit of gas lift, what that incremental rate would be by reducing the bottom hole pressure with a little bit of gas lift. So we'll save this as gas lift 300 Great. And what if we increase gas lift to 700 MTF a day? And so we're starting to see, no gas lift, a little bit of gas lift, and a little bit more gas lift, right? So we can start to do these sensitivities, which is exactly what we want to do really quickly, right? Now, if we want to be a little bit more rigorous with planning, designing our gas lift, instead of doing pour boy assumptions, we can go and pick the valve option, which is where we could specify different valve depths, different valve open close pressures, and this is where that planning can really happen. Before you complete the well, for your production team to really plan and design the gas lift easily. Okay. Now for this, the next thing I want to do is consider, well, what if I put an ESP on this well instead? Okay, so again, this well has 7,000 feet TVD. We're going to land the ESP at 6,500 feet, so about 500 feet above the bottom here. And we can specify our pump intake pressure to be whatever we like here. Okay, and then this is our outflow curve and our operating point with an ESP in the well. And we see that the bottom hole pressure is about 1,090 PSI. Well, where did that extra 90 PSI come from? Because I want my pump intake pressure right at 1,000 pounds. Well, the 90 PSI is just because of the hydrostatic and a little bit of friction between the pump depth and the perforations, which are 500 feet below. So we're accounting for that difference. So the whole point here is, again, for something that production engineers do every single day, which is IPR TPC curves, it needs to be super fast and easy. And I just wanted to make sure you guys are all aware about how that's possible in WITS and Plus, even without doing any RTA work at all. Okay. Now, Matthias mentioned early on that the same sort of functionality is going to be available for gas wells using a gas IPR. That'll be available in a couple of weeks here, and we'll be able to do these same sort of quick sensitivities for different tubing sizes to avoid liquid loading, whether it's compression or changing the tubing size. So again, the whole point is it has to be really quick and easy, which I think we've done well. The last thing I want to show you is a little bit more about what is around the corner, and some of this is we're planning on doing it, and the other thing is kind of brainstorming that I want to put out there to get your feedback to learn, would this be valuable? Okay, so this is a plot that I was shown a few months ago, and it's really for gas lift optimization. And so what this is showing is, as we increase our gas lift rate, we should expect our fluid rate to also increase as we lower that bottom hole flowing pressure. But at some point, there's going to be this kind of mechanical max rate that we can achieve. And beyond that, all that extra gas that we're injecting is really just creating more friction, and it's actually increasing the bottom hole flowing pressure, which is not what we want. And so we want to, ideally be somewhere here or maybe a little bit earlier. So to produce this, we need an IPR curve. We need an IPR curve for the well, and we need to know the wellbore dimensions, and from there we can create this sort of diagnostic plot. So what is really important is seeing where we are. So we want to see, this is our current rate, this is our mechanical max rate. What does that mean? Well, it means that we can see what the uplift potential is for a well. We know this is available, and in order to get that, we would have to increase the gas lift rate by so much, right? So this is something that we do have planned to come out later in Whitson, but what I want to show you next is more just of a brainstorming thing. Okay, so I want to get your feedback on this. So what if we did this for every single well, for dozens or hundreds of wells, where we were able to again, just from having the IPR curve for each well, see what the uplift is from adjusting the gas lift rate from where we are now to the maximum potential liquid production rate we could have, right? It's going to be unique for every single well. And once we quantified that uplift potential for each well, we could rank it. Right now we have a priority list of wells that we want to start on to adjust the gas lift rate. And of course, visualizing it on a bubble map would be amazing as well. Again, this is just some brainstorming to get some feedback. Okay, now this is just one sensitivity for operating conditions in terms of gas lift. There's a lot of other sensitivities we would want to consider for the same sort of ranking. Instead of just moving them all up to their max rate, what if we just mass applied a gas lift rate that was 100 MCF, right? What if we increased all the gas lift rates by 100 MCF? What would be the liquid rate uplift for all the wells at once? Or what if the valve that is being injected differs among all the wells? What if we were to go to poor boy gas lift all of a sudden on all the wells? What would the uplift be on a mass basis for the field? Or even getting into gas wells, what if we were to reduce all the well head pressures, but by 200 pounds? What would be the net uplift for all the wells? Or reducing them to a target flowing pressure, what would be the uplift for all the wells? Or let's say the wells have a mix of tubing sizes. What if we were to change them all to 2 3/8? What would the quantity of that? Well, maybe not uplift, but how long would we delay liquid loading by in terms of months into the future? So again, it is important to look at this on a well by well basis, but ultimately we want to do it for all the wells so we can rank and prioritize them, and then even roll up what that uplift could be in a field level. So again, these are just some quick sensitivities that came to mind. But again, this is really just for brainstorming to kind of think about the future. So that's kind of the end of my talk. I really just want to shut up and either email Matthias or go ahead and ask a question or speak up if there's any feedback to these ideas. Thank you.
Perfect, Graham. I don't know if there were any questions here. I see there's some good discussion in the chat box here, so that's good. In general, Graham, for you, when it comes to kind of things on the nodal side that you're most excited about yourself, of all the things that we're getting in there, do you have like a top thing that you would say is the most the thing that's highest on your list? I think you're muted, by the way, if you're talking.
Yeah, thank you. I would say this curve is something that I'm the most excited about, because it's something that was presented to me this year that I had never seen before. But when I speak with production engineers, it's something that they all have been doing kind of in Excel or on the back of a napkin. And so I don't know, I'm most excited about this, which I think will be coming later this year in Whitson from what I heard.
Perfect. Awesome. Great, Graham. Thanks a lot. If anybody has any questions or feedback on some of the functionality, feel free to reach out to Graham ASAP. And with that, we'll go over to the next presenter, who is Moeen from Devon. Moeen was actually probably one of the absolute very first people I met ever in the industry that was kind of non-Whitson person, I guess. Met them up in Woodlands at some kind of conference that was up there. I think it was August in 2016 or 17 or something like that. And he has the last few, I guess, I don't know, you have to speak to the timeline there, Wayne, but at least lately, I guess the last year or a couple of years, worked on this thing that we call DQI. It's kind of new for a lot of people. It was kind of presented and provided to the public a little bit earlier this year, maybe a few months ago. So it's still pretty fresh, but I'm sure people will learn a little bit more about it now. So with that, Moeen, floor is yours.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Matthias. Do you guys hear me? Do you see my monitor and my camera?
Yeah, so see the presentation perfectly. Excellent.
Excellent, perfect. Well, I'm thrilled to be here with you for the first time, and thanks for taking the time from your morning to be here today. And thank you, Matthias, for the invite. Yes, we met in around 2014, and it was the Reserves Conference, and I think, was it in the Nadarco building at that time? And I don't remember. It's been a while.
Not me either.
Yep. So my name is Moina Masoudi. I'm Reservoir Engineering Manager here at Devon, and I work in our corporate subsurface team, and I lead a multidisciplinary team that supports our 5 basins, the 5 basins that we operate in. And today I'll go with you over the DQI method, the Devon quantification of interference. And feel free to ask any questions you have. I'll go step by step through the method, and I'll show you a few examples as well. So here is the agenda for my talk. So I'll go over an overview over interference testing in general. Then I'll go over the DQI technique, and then we'll go over the reservoir simulation validation, the work that we've done with Refract, and I'll also go over some validation with interference testing that we've executed in the field, and then summarize everything with a few takeaways. We have a paper that we put online. I think Graham actually put that on LinkedIn as well. And I'm sharing the title here with you, so feel free to go ahead and download the paper. It has much more detail than what I'm presenting today. And also the paper, we've submitted the paper for a journal review, and it got approved actually last week. The process was very smooth. I was expecting a lot of back and forth, but it was really, really smooth. And all the examples that I'm showing today are going to be in the paper as well. So let's start with interference testing in general. This is a cartoon that I put together to illustrate the concept. So here you're looking at a map view that shows 2 wells where we are going to do some interference testing. The 2 wells, they have varying fracture geometries along the lateral of the wellbore, and I'm showing the half length of these wells of the fractures. And you see also that there is 2 regions. There is a red region, and it's in a cartoonish way that shows where is the proppant, and the location of the proppant shown in red, and the full length in a black. Let me see if I can get my laser. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring these wells online. I'm going to keep the shut-in well, the monitoring well, and then I'm going to bring the offset well online. So we expect something like this, where we don't have interference between these 2 wells because we don't have hydraulic fracture overlap between these wells. So we're assuming here, since we have a small permeability in the matrix, the interference we're seeing is happening through the hydraulic fractures. And in a situation where we don't have hydraulic fracture overlap, we don't have interference signal. Now I'm going to play another scenario where I move the well and either make the well closer to the other well, or a situation where we have longer hydraulic fracture geometries that are conductive and they are overlapping. And in a situation like this, we will see a change in the pressure trend on the monitoring well. We see a decline on the monitoring well pressure signal, and we see this over and over with the interference testing. It's pretty much consistent signal, and I'll show you that with actual field data. Now, in this cartoon, one thing that I assume that all the hydraulic fractures along the wellbore are in overlap. In reality, that's not necessarily the truth. There could be few hydraulic fractures that are overlapping and results in an interference response. We won't be able to differentiate that scenario where you have full overlap versus a few hydraulic fractures in overlap. For that, we need additional data such as fiber to be able to tell us where we have the overlap along the lateral of the wellbore. Just something difficult to analyze with interference testing. The other dimension that we need to consider with interference is the height component. So now I'm showing you a map view where the focus is on hydraulic fracture half length, but the reality is you could have hydraulic fracture overlap both in along the half length and also in the height. So here I'm showing a cartoon where we have 2 benches in zone 1 and zone 2, and we have a lower well, and you could have a fracture that's extending upward, or fracture coming downward, where they results in hydraulic fracture overlap. And they show also the same interference signal. So the question that I want to investigate today is how do we characterize that interference signal that I presented here to you and obtain some insights into the fracture properties. Right? The overlapped area, is there a way for us to extract physical parameters such as conductivity of the fractures, and can we do that by using some analytical models and match that signal that we are seeing here. So there is an attempt on that. There is a work that the work that probably many of you are familiar with, the CPG approach, where they apply a derivative to the pressure signal. So let me take a step back. So here is an example from one of the wells that we have in the Delaware Basin, where we have two wells offsetting each other, and then you have that pressure response that I just showed in the cartoon earlier. So you can see that the pressure is declining here. You have just leak off after the hydraulic fracture operations, and then you brought the well online around this time, and you start to have that pressure decline. The CPG approach is really straightforward and practical, where you forecast the trend prior to interference, as you see here in this green line, and then you take the difference between the green line, the forecasted pressure signal, and the signal coming from interference, and that will be your delta P, and you calculate the Bourdet derivative of that, and then you divide the delta P divided by 2 times the derivative to come up with the CPG number. Obviously, the CPG is going to be a series of values. Then you average those values to come up with an MPI, which is the magnitude of a pressure interference. Often, people, they use MPI and CPG interchangeably, but CPG is the multiple values. MPI is a signal value, which is just the average of the CPG points. Now, the challenge for me when I start implementing a CPG approach is it doesn't take into consideration the fluid type that it's in between the monitoring well and the producing well. So in situations where you have a gas reservoir, you would expect that the CPG, CPG number is going to be different than a CPG where you have an oil reservoir. Compressibilities are different, the delta P is going to be impacted, and that's going to give a different understanding of the hydraulic fracture geometry. If the goal is to understand the connectivity of these two hydraulic fractures that are overlapping, then that could lead in a misleading understanding of the connectivity strength. So to investigate that, we said, well, that's what we understand in our minds, but let's put that in the simulator in a controlled environment and try to understand if we see this behavior. So that's what we did. Next, I'll jump through this. So we've done extensive work with the Refract. We used their coupled reservoir and a frac simulator. So what we've investigated 2 things. We've looked at in a simple scenario where we have a single fracture, a simple model, and we looked at different conductivities in the fracture. So we did input the conductivity, and we looked at the range from 0.1 millidarcy foot all the way to 1,000 millidarcy foot. And also we've analyzed interference using the CPG approach over 24 hours, 48 hours, 1 week, and also we looked at a longer term for 4 weeks. And then we've done that, and then we start to see that CPG does increase with the fracture conductivity. We did not change the fluid properties in this exercise, so we kept the fluid the same. And when we did that, we see that the CPG does increase with conductivity, so it does predict better conductivity between the wells. But what we've also seen that CPG increases with the duration. So the longer that we do the test, we analyze the data over a longer period of time, we see also that the CPG is increasing. And that's basically related to the flow regimes. As flow regimes are changing, we get into different slopes resulting in different CPG number. The other observation is that the number does not stop at 1. So the general understanding is a CPG is between 0 is an index, between 0 and 1. 0 is no interference, 1 is the maximum interference, but there is nothing that stops the equation that I showed you earlier, delta P divided by 2 delta P derivative, to stop at 1. We've seen some situation where the value exceeds 1, and then you can see that here as well. So let's take a step back and say let's think about this differently, and let's look at the analytical models out there available that looks at the pressure disturbance between 2 wells, and try to modify those, or maybe use something that's available to model the interference phenomena, just using straight pressure transient analysis. So what we proposed is basically a new procedure where we fit the initial interference response with the solution to the 1D diffusivity equation at an offset observation point. Now, this is an example that shows the procedure. So we start with the pressure delta P, similar to what you start with when you conduct CPG analysis. So you get your delta P. Here we're calculating T dP dt, a derivative, and then we use the diffusivity equation to fit the data. So you could see in this example, we are fitting both the delta P and then the derivatives nicely with the analytical model. Now, we have 2 parameters in the analytical model, and I'll explain those in detail in the next slide. We have the hydraulic diffusivity, and we have K kappa, which is basically the conductivity times height divided by viscosity. And I'll go over that in a second. Before I dive in this, Matthias, how am I doing on time? Is it 10 minutes or 15 minutes?
You're doing great. We're much more flexible than in a typical. I love this stuff, so please do it at whatever pace.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, so the first step is basically that I just showed, which you orient the data, or you organize the data in a similar fashion to what you basically do with your CPG assessment. And the next step, we compute diffusivity from pressure change. Now, for a flow through a porous media, the hydraulic diffusivity is equal to the square root of permeability divided by porosity and total compressibility divided by porosity, total compressibility, and viscosity. Now, in a fracture, it's more appropriate to define hydraulic diffusivity in terms of fracture conductivity and aperture. So here you're seeing that we are considering the aperture and the width of the hydraulic fracture. And something that jumps on us is the change of width with respect to pressure. That's a difficult parameter to capture, but we use just generic number for that, and we have the hydraulic fracture width. And you'll see later these 2 parameters can be sensitized on to gain better understanding of what best fit the data. Diffusivity itself comes directly from matching the data, and kappa comes also from matching the data. The model is here for you. That's basically the 1D diffusivity equation. Here are sensitivities we're doing on both the alpha parameter and the kappa parameter. So you're seeing that the alpha seems it's more controlling the onset or the beginning of interference, whereas the kappa has more control over the curvature. The dashed lines in both plots representing the derivative, and the solid line represent the delta P. Now, next we calculate the dimensionless number LD, and that's basically defined as to be the maximum possible drainage distance along the fractures. So if hypothetically the well is unbounded and had infinite probe length, this is the drainage distance. Basically, this is the maximum drainage distance that can be achieved. The way we do that is basically we conduct material balance on the flow along the fracture, and the flow from the matrix into the fracture. So we have a Q flow into the fracture, inside the fracture, and we have also, assuming matrix linear flow, the flow coming from the matrix into the fracture based on the work that Mark conducted in 2019. If you equate these two equations together, we can come up with the maximum length that can be drained. Now, what we do next, we take that distance and then we divide that by, we take that length and we divide that by half the distance between the two wells in interference to make the number dimensionless. Now, what we do next, since we have defined that dimensionless interference length, we can cross-plot this along any metric that we deem representative of impact of interference. So in this case, I used the degree of production interference, or defined the degree of production interference as the change in rate before and after interference. And I use that my x-axis, my y-axis, and then I calculated the dimensionless interference length as my x-axis to be the predictor of the degree of production interference between two wells that are interfering with each other. And then what we did, we took all the simulations that we've conducted and we tried to see if we can predict the degree of production interference under varying well spacing, fracture conductivities, fracture fluid viscosity change, and compressibilities. So you can see that the LD parameter that I've went through based on the diffusivity model to calculate the conductivity, and then conducting material balance on a Q from the matrix into the frac and from the frac into the wellbore, it does predict really well these points, and it does collapse nicely on a curve that I'll define in a second. But I did the same exercise with the CPG over 24 hours time, and I said, let me take a look at what CPG, how does CPG predict the degree of production interference? Now, you see that CPG does a nice job with varying spacing. So as a function of distance, that CPG does predict the degree of production interference, and that's illustrated by the orange points. However, when you have varying viscosity in the fluid, when you vary the fluid viscosity, you go from a point maybe 1 on a CPG to a 1. CPG start to have variability in the CPG response. Also, when you have varying fluid compressibilities, and that's shown with the square here and the square here, you start these two cases, you go from a 0.1 to a 0.4 CPG. So if you have consistent fluid properties maybe, and you don't have varying fluid properties in between the wells, and the main driver is the fracture conductivity and the distance between the wells, then really CPG seems it does capture that really well. Now, the other thing we've done with all these simulation cases, I said, okay, well, can we establish a relationship, empirical relationship between DPI and LD? And it turned out there is this function that captures this behavior. It's a empirical function, and then I'll use as an example for you in a second with actual field data to plug into that equation, the LD, and get an idea about what the degree of production impact or the degree of interference on the wells. Now, the next section, I'll show some validation using the reservoir simulation. So we took a really simple case where we have two wells that they are have one hydraulic fracture that's connecting both of them, and we don't have a gradient in conductivity. It's a very simple case, and in the paper you'll have a case where you have a gradient in conductivity, and also you have degradation of conductivity over time and due to increase of effective stresses on the proppant pack. So we have simulated those, but here I'll show you just a simple example where you have the same conductivity connecting between two wells. So we said, let's input the conductivity and see if we can use pressure transient analysis to predict that conductivity. So that's what we did here in this exercise. And this is, again, the visual that we used to analyze to fit the data. It's really straightforward, just adjusting the equation alpha and kappa parameters to get a match to the delta P and the derivative. And here, these are the input fracture conductivities that we did input into the model. So we did have a 0.1, 1, 10, and 100. And this is the predicted conductivity using the DQI method. So I feel it's really close. It predicts nicely the conductivities on these wells. And also we report the alpha and the kappa parameters because hydraulic diffusivity has a meaning on its own, and that can be used also as a metric that we can use to correlate different completion sizes and different well performance. So that's the way that we like to present this. And in fact, you can also throw in your CPG here and get an idea about how the CPG vary given now you have the alpha, kappa, and the frac conductivity estimate. So let's take a look on an example from the field. This is an example from the Anadarko Basin, where we have 4 wells offsetting a depleted well. This well was depleted for about 3 years before bringing those wells online. And here you're looking at the pressure responses from the 4 gauges that we have, and also showing you the order on which these wells came online. So well number 1 is the red. That one came online first. And then we have well number 2, the green well, and then 3 orange, and then the blue, which is basically the furthest away from the parent well. So now we took this data and we said, okay, let's analyze this using the DQI workflow. So for the interference between 1 and 2, we get about 0.5 to 0.6 LD, and the conductivity from 0.4 to 0.6. And the reason there is a range on this is basically we are matching the data in 2 different ways, and that results in a range in the estimates of the conductivity. Now, we did not see any interference between the 1 and the 3, and that's about like 1760 feet away from 1. And also we did not observe interference between 1 and 4. That's the furthest away well in the upper reservoir. Then we saw interference between 2 and 3, 2 and 4, and 3 and 4. What's interesting is the 1 to 2 interference is basically, that 1 to 2 is significantly lower interference than what you're seeing between 2 and 3. And essentially we have this parent wells. We believe that the fracture geometries tend to grow in the direction of the depleted reservoir, depleted well, and that manifests itself in a lower overlapping conductivity or lower interference. What we did next, we've estimated CPG in all of those combinations of well pairs, and also we plugged into the DPI the LD value to try to get an idea about was the degree of production interference or degree of production impact on the offset well. So you see some scenarios that shows that based on the early data, those wells, the offset well will have a 70% impact on the offset well due to interference. These numbers are high, in my opinion, and not representative of the long-term performance, because we see loss of hydraulic fracture conductivity over time and that degradation. So this number, I view it as a dynamic number that changes over the life of well, as we produce the offset well, and we have the reduction of the conductivity in the hydraulic fracture, these numbers tends to go down. But at the time of interference, early time during flowback, that's what we are seeing between these two well pairs. I think I'll leave it here. We do believe that interference tests via downhole pressure gauges are really cost-effective diagnostics, but we also believe that interference testing by itself will not tell us the full story on well performance, and it's need to be integrated with additional data sets. Also, we believe that the DQI it's a practical procedure, and it does maximize the value of the downhole gauges that we routinely implement in our operations, and we believe there are several advantages to it. It takes into account the change in a drawdown strategy, with a CPG approach. Like if you change the drawdown strategy, that could result in a misleading CPG, and then it will lead in a misleading interpretation actually of the fracture conductivity. We do also believe it's the approach like this relate the interference signature to a physical parameter, like the fracture conductivity, which is where people are more comfortable. I am more comfortable with the physical parameter that's measured in millidarcy foot than an index. And I think also it provides framework to tie the conductivity to the production, to the impact on the production on the offset well, and it takes into account the rock properties such as the matrix permeability, the viscosity of the fluid, compressibility, and we do believe these are important to fully understand the interference response. So I'll leave it here, and it's I think my last slide is the acknowledgement. I really would like to acknowledge the field staff that helped us to implement the gauges, and Refract that helped us through the development of the model, the testing of the model, and just kind of brainstorming to come up with to arrive to the procedure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wayne. This was a great presentation. Actually answered a lot of my questions, I guess, that we had here as well. Just, one of the beautiful things about CPG, even though it's kind of, it has some obvious flaws that we I think all can appreciate, is that it's kind of like one number. It's like one number that it tries to communicate a lot of things in one number. Here, when it comes to like communicating the KPI of kind of characterizing that interference, would you suggest to kind of provide that full table with all the parameters basically, or would you kind of only provide this like percentage calculations of the I guess you call the quantification of interference there? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the best way in my mind is to present it is to show the full range of the parameter that you are estimating. That's the way that I like to present the table, if I'm understanding your question. So basically we show what is the hydraulic diffusivity, which is coming from matching the delta P and the delta P derivative. Show the kappa, which is the conductivity times height, I forgot the equation, compressibility times height divided by, let me just go back real quick. By viscosity, yeah. Right? And then if you want to do the analysis using just the delta P divided by delta P derivative, which is CPG, maybe you want to show that as well. And then once you have those, if you have the hydraulic diffusivity, you are one step away from calculating the fracture conductivity, right? And then you can show the fracture conductivity. The DPI, that's an empirical based on the fit to those data points that's coming from simulation. So that's the least certain parameter I would worry about. But if you want to go ahead and put that in, you can. But certainly the parameter that you're chasing is the hydraulic diffusivity parameter, right? And that's something you need to be presented in my mind.
Yeah, very nice. And if you were supposed to like pick one of those, I think we may I thought that
diffusivity, yeah.
Okay. Okay. No, very, very cool. I think just thinking a little bit about it for my own sake, I would love to have seen kind of all of them, and then I can cherry pick probably which one. Okay.
Yeah,
no,
One thing I would add, again, this is just showing the number, but what does the number tell me about my development, my well spacing, what I'm going to change in my next unit? I think that would be up to the operator, right? Where you take those numbers, you conduct your interference testing, and then you use an empirical approach to go and concatenate or cross plot against your production metrics, early production metrics, long-term production metrics, and see if something sticks out and you can use for the area.
Awesome. So we have a couple of questions here related to the DQI approach. Does it answer long-term interactions when you start to look at like DQI at 60, 90, or 100 days? Or should your approach only be approached or looked at for shorter time period for now? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, the nice thing with the DQI does not care about and maybe that's something I did not explain in detail. It cares mainly about the beginning of interference. So the time you see the interference has more weight than the long-term trend, if that makes sense. So you're trying to quantify, you bring your offset well online, and how long does it take to see the interference on the offset well? That time is more important than what happens in the longer term. In the longer term, there will be non-linearities that the diffusivity equation in its form that we're using now, it will not capture. So I would certainly focus on the early time.
Awesome. Peter has a question here as well. Can DQI analysis be done with calculated bottom hole pressures from surface gauges? Or yeah, whether that's CPG or like any of this, what's your thoughts on that in general?
That's a great question. And so we've done analysis like this, but I have not got really good luck with that. So I always get better responses with having just a downhole gauge. But maybe the data set need to be expanded, and maybe conduct the analysis on more wells and see if you get better results with that.
Yeah,
I've done it also on the surface gauges, and I didn't get good results, mainly because of gas in the wellbore, and just made it difficult to predict.
Very good. So with that, we are going to go over to the last presentation here. There's probably a few other questions that maybe you can answer in the chat there, Moin. Really appreciate it again. Really awesome stuff. It's always fun to see these new developments in the industry. Next up now is my colleague and our COO, Mo. It's going to go through some practical things on the filtering. And then after that, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to start the last part of today, which is 3 presentations after or just before lunch there. So with that, Mo, I'm going to give the floor to you. For those who don't know Mo, I'm pretty sure a lot of people know him and interact with him. He's always there in the background, answering emails and support, and deciding kind of together with myself on what we prioritize, at least short term, and with some plus and stuff. So one thing, and this is kind of the true story of kind of the filtering feature, is that I was up in Oklahoma City, which I'm almost every month. Had met a couple of the Devon engineers out for just some food just after work there, and before I was going to head to the airport, and they talked about the filtering functionality in the software that yeah, I love Woods and Plus, but the filtering functionality sucks, and I have to agree, at the time it was really bad, so we put some efforts into improving it, and hopefully Mo can show some of that today. And it's really important for the whole audience, I think, that you use Woods and Plus to be aware of this functionality, because it's going to save you a lot of headache. So that's why we go through it here. So with that, Mo, I'm just going to leave it to you.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so as Matthias said, we heard some feedback that our filtering functionality basically sucked, and we tried to make it better. And I want to say a big thank you to Sarah from Devon, who spent the time to handhold us on what it meant for her to make a better filtering functionality, like what it meant for her to be able to filter as she wanted. And we tried to get those thoughts and develop them. like we discussed with her. So we'll present that to you now. And the main reason that we're presenting this is because it's new, it's unknown, it's very basic, but it's new. And also because we would like to hear your feedback on how we could make it better. So please feel free to just send your messages or an email about that. As Matthias said, those who don't know me, my name is Mohammed. Everyone calls me Mo. Yeah, and do a lot of different things in the company, mostly related to the software. I really love the software and everything that we're doing there. It's like a dream come true. And yeah, so if with that, I can just get started now. And what I'm going to go through is just a couple of very simple things, simple questions or topics that I want to cover. First is what can we filter on? Like when we have a long list of wells, what can we use to filter on? Then how is the filtering that we apply, how is it linked through the software, and how can you actually filter throughout the software, not only where can you filter and how is it linked throughout? And also how you can do filtering in the GIS map and how that's linked as well in the software. Then the possibility of sorting at multiple levels. Initially, we had the possibility of sorting, but now you can sort not only at one level, but also we have an additional level of sorting that I will demonstrate now. And then finally, grouping of wells, which I know that many companies are using, but some of you are not aware of it or how you can kind of make the best out of it. So this will show how to do the grouping and how you can use it in different features in Watson Plus as well. Okay, so with that, we'll start with what can we filter on. So first, let me show you. We can filter basically on a keyword in the well name or UWI. And the way we do that, I have a project here on Watson Plus. Let me just make this actually disappear. Like this is better. This is a project in Watson Plus where I've loaded a bunch of wells, and this is the wells feature or the wells overview that you get in the software by clicking the wells tab on the navigation panel here. And in this well overview, you simply can click this filter icon, and that will pop up this. And so the first thing you can do is just say, okay, I want to search based on a keyword that exists in my well name or my UWI. So I could just type a number like 5 here and then save. Then it will basically filter all my well list just to keep the wells that have that specific number. Then I can also say, actually, I also would like to filter on a group. And here's just 2 groups that I have pre-created. So let's say you say, I want the wells that match this number 5 keyword, but I also want the ones that belong to the Q3 top performers. And then you save, and that will basically make your well list even smaller. In addition to that, let's say you didn't want to do this, but you wanted to go ahead and say, I want to filter based on an attribute. So any attribute that you have in Watson Plus, any well attribute, initial reservoir pressure, number of fractures, any value that you have in Watson Plus, the reservoir, you can use to filter. So in this case, let's say I just wanted to get my well list, but I wanted to make sure that I picked the wells that had an initial reservoir pressure that was higher than 4,500 PSI, for example. And you save, that gives me a well list that is only filtered down to the wells that are larger than 4,500 PSI. And let's say I wanted to make sure actually to select that plus from a group that I had created before, which was the Refract candidates for Q3. I just have to pick that group and the wells will apply together. So at the same time, I'll be filtering on the group and on the wells that have an initial reservoir pressure higher than 4,500. So then you get this individual well. Okay. So those are the main things. In addition, one big request that we've gotten from people is the possibility of just copy pasting a list of UWIs or well names. That's because you probably have a database, some other database where you're able to fetch, okay, these are the UWIs that are relevant for me. And you would like to come into Watson Plus and you would like to say, hey, these are the 10 wells that I want. Filter them for me. Give me only those 10 wells. And that's, let's say you have a list like this, or you have the 10 wells that you're interested in working with. You just copy that list into this table here, which expands with the input that you provide. And then if you click save, it will basically filter your, let's say you have 1,000 wells in your project, it will filter it down to only the wells that you selected that were matching basically the well names, the UWIs that you have. Okay. So that's the main things that you can filter on. But then also the very important thing that you can do, which is my next point, is okay, you can filter on all these things. That's what we can filter on. But then how is it linked throughout the software? How is it linked in Wisdom Plus? And that's the one that I've shown you now is the main well list, which is in the wells feature. That's this. Everyone who has touched the software should be familiar with this feature, I hope. But the other two places that I'll show you, I think not necessarily everyone is aware of. The next one is the top bar well list. And how does that look like? That's if I go into any feature here on the left navigation panel. Let's say I go into my production data, okay? Then at the top of the software, you always have a navigation bar, which allows you to know where you're standing, and it allows you to go other places. So right now I'm standing in the field that's called Marcellus. The project is demo filtering, and the well is the well that you're seeing here. Now, right next to this, you see a filter icon, and that's because this list here now is not showing all the many wells that I have in my project, but this is already filtered down based on the filter that I applied when I was looking at the wells. So that's persistent, basically, the well list. And I can also click on this and just also reset that filter. I say reset it, then it resets the whole filter, and now I see the long list of wells. Okay, and I can apply a new filter here. Suddenly, okay, oh, actually, why should I see all these wells? I just want to focus on the refract candidates I'm working on. I just focus on those 3 guys. Okay, so that's the next place where you can apply it. That's the top navigation bar. One thing that I just want to mention now that I think some people don't realize is that all these drop downs that you see at the top, they are searchable. So let's say I went back to my really long list of wells that I had here, and I just wanted to search a well name directly. This list here is searchable, and it's what's called a fuzzy search. That means that when I type something, it will automatically update as I'm typing. So you see now I type number 7, and it will filter the 3 wells that belong to 7. If I delete, it will just show all of those. And I think many people are not actually aware that this is a searchable list. So that's just important to mention. Okay. The next place where you can do the filtering is in the edit all. And where is that? That's on if you go to the well list, again, you have a button here on the top right that allows you to edit all. And that is basically to allow to edit any attribute that corresponds to the well. So first, let me resize this column here so I can see the UWI, the well name. And then I can filter basically here because here it's a little better for me to look at the different attributes that I'm interested in filtering based on. So let's say I'm interested in filtering based on initial reservoir pressure. So I click on this icon again. Then I say initial reservoir pressure larger than 4,500. Save. Then it filters down to that list. Which is only wells that are higher than 4,500. And this is, again, persistent throughout the software. So now, if I suddenly want to go to my production data view, then that filtering will apply that I use in the editor. Okay. The next thing is filtering in GIS. And that's, if I go back to my long well list here, and I go into the well list here, and I click the GIS functionality here at the top, that will basically bring me to our GIS functionality, and it will show me basically all the wells that belong to this field and this project for me to just have a look at. Okay, let's say these are all the wells that are in my project, but I actually don't want to look at all these wells because I want to just focus on working on a subset of these wells. So I can apply the filter also here in the same way that I've done it before. So I can say, okay, show me only the Q3 refract candidates here. And it's going to show me those 3 wells only. And that's something I could do. The other thing I could do is I could go here and say, select a subset of those wells. So let's say in this case, it's only 2. I want to select these 2 wells, and I can also group these 2 wells into a specific group, like which I'm going to talk about later. I can create a specific group that is okay. This is the Q3 refract in the western zone, for example, or in the western area. Okay. That's basically filtering in GIS, and the filter also persists when you apply it in GIS. When you apply it in the well list, it will persist with you, and it will go basically to all the features that you are working on. And you can always remove the filter from the top bar here by resetting all. Okay. Then the next thing I would like to show you is the ability to sort at multiple levels. And this is something that also our friends at Devon requested. So let's say I'm on this well list, and right now I'm checking here. I have this well list. I'd like to sort it because I have a bunch of, I have 2 different reservoirs. I have reservoir A and reservoir B inside here, and then, or maybe the different landing zones. And then I would like to sort it. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Then to sort it, instead of clicking this filtering, I just click on this sorting button here, and I want to sort it based on reservoir. I want to say, okay, reservoir, ascending, and save. That will give me basically a list that is sorted based on reservoir. So first the ones belonging to reservoir A, and then the ones belonging to reservoir B. But then to work through this list, I actually would like it to then sort it based on the UWI or the well name. So that's alphabetically sorted based on the well name. That's where the second order of sorting comes in. So now based on well name, I can also do ascending, and then it will also sort that. Now it's sorted based on reservoir first, but then based on UWI, or in this case, well name. Okay. And you can use anything. You could use any attribute to sort on. So you could sort on reservoir pressure, temperature, reservoir height, number of fractures, etc. All right. And then the next thing, basically the final thing I'd like to cover is how to do the grouping in Witson Plus. I've shown you one way to do it, which is in the GIS functionality. But you can also do it in the well list here, where you can basically just select the wells that you would like to group. So you could do something like this and create a group that you would like to create. And groups are either private or company-wide. Private means only you can see it, only your user can see it. Company-wide, everyone in the company will be able to see it. You can also, what most people do is that they filter first to be able to create the group. So they want to create, like, again, like a high pressure set of wells. So then they would filter, okay, everything that's higher than 5,500 or 5,600 PSI. Then they filter, maybe no wells are there. This is Marcellus, so let's see. Yeah, everything higher than 4,500 PSI. And then you can create a group based on that filtered list. And you say, okay, these are my high pressure wells. Right? Okay. So that's the grouping functionality that allows you to basically create a group that will apply to a subset of wells. And that's a very easy way to create that. But now, how do you use that? Why do you need to create groups, right? So there's, and that's what I would like to show you here. So basically, that you can use that in the diagnostic plots and in type well. So basically, in any of the multi-well features that we have here. As an example, if I go to the diagnostic plot here, right now you'll see that you have a well list here on the left that you can select from. So I could select a single well like this. It will show the diagnostic plot for that well. But then I could say, okay, actually just pick from either my private groups that I have created or my company-wide groups. And if I click on that, then it will select all the wells in that group. You see that here. Now it's selected these 2 wells in addition to this one, and it will put those onto the diagnostic plot. And the same applies to type 1, basically. Okay, that's why you would mainly use groups in Witson Plus and how you would use them. And then the final bonus that I'm not showing you here, but it's something that is implemented and it will become available in the next release, is that when you filter and apply sorting, that sorting or filtering will persist even after you refresh or after you log out. And that I really like the way Sarah Devon mentioned it, and she said, then the user comes back to work to the same state they left. And they really like that. We really like that at Twitch, and we thought it was a very good idea. So now, basically, if you applied some filtering, you applied some sorting, and you logged out and you came back 3 days later, you'll see the exact same filtering applied and the same sorting. You just, if you don't want it, you just reset it. All right. That was it from my end.
Perfect.
I feel it was very, very bad compared to all the very good technical presentations out there. But
Pretty good.
Something to put out there.
Even I learned a little bit, but I think it's important for the folks to. And I saw we got some good feedback here, and I think
awesome.
Yeah, just a couple of things here. The custom attributes, are they in that drop-down full menu right now?
Yes,
Yeah.
they're added. They've been added, and that was also a request. So they've been added. So you could filter. You can filter based on custom attributes basically now. I don't have a specific custom attribute here, but yes, it will.
Yeah.
It's added there.
And can you, because I know we're working on this, but I can't remember if we have it in the software now. So like editing and deletion of custom attributes.
It's currently being reviewed actually. So the code is finalized and it's in a peer review process. So it should be approved fairly soon, and then it will be shipped. I'm hoping in the next couple of days, latest.
Okay.
1 week from now.
Great. Yeah, perfect. And if you know, when people try it out and stuff, feel free to come in and ask for further enhancements and whatnot on that.
Maybe on the custom attributes, if someone doesn't know what that is basically you have the existing attributes that exist in your well, and you can just create a new attribute that's your own. You create it, you decide what you want to put there. That's where you do that. And the question was if you could filter based on that custom attribute, and answer is yes. It was
perfect. I think Curtis has a question.
Yeah, I didn't really have a question. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. I've really enjoyed the whole series of presentations, and I wanted to make a comment about this one. I think it just illustrates just a great example. And I take no credit for this because these guys here are really the ones doing all the work and design and the interaction with the companies. But this interaction with Sarah that you guys have had on developing these capabilities and features just shows another example of how this collaboration directly with industrial partners and users and potential users of the software has led to just a software development that, you know, benefits everybody. I think everybody's seeing that. And I just think that this forum is showing that kind of collaboration at a high level, and these capabilities, without the input and interaction with Sarah, then, what we might have created on our own would be certainly a much inferior solution to the one that we have now. So I kind of want to give a kudos to both the partners and the guys and folks working within the company to make sure that these things happening, that it's a customer driven product. So it impresses me as well.
Really
to everyone who provides feedback. Like sometimes people think we get cringy or something if you provide us feedback. Actually, it's the best thing that could happen. It's really like there, because we don't know, otherwise we don't know, and we really appreciate it. So keep that feedback coming, please.
Awesome. So we're going to take a quick break now. Thanks again, Mo, and also great comments from Curtis there. If there's any feedback on this topic, just direct them directly to Mo. You have his email, or send an email to support if you have questions and whatnot, and we're happy to receive that. We're going to do a quick break now. So after the break, we're going to be back here at 10:35 Houston time. So that's 9:35 Mountain time. And we're going to start with the first presentation by Narayan, then a presentation by Jason, and then a presentation by Ale as well in the end there. So with that, we'll be back here in 10 minutes.
You presented something cool here.
There we go. So ready to rumble. Sharp at
You told
10.
me after.
Narayan, your screen is coming through okay. Sound is clear and good as well. A lot of you know Narayan from before. He's been presented at WitCon also last year. I tell that every time when I introduce people about Narayan that he a lunch with Narayan, Curtis, and myself, and I didn't know anything about anything. It's the first time I ever heard the word RTA. I don't know if maybe Curtis remembers this still. Narayan said the word RTA, and that was kind of, he liked quantitative things and a lot of data and that stuff. So RTA was something that he liked when he was in school and stuff. And I remember I asked a little bit embarrassingly, "What is RTA?" And then both of them looked at me really fast and like, "Rate transient analysis," like as I should have known. So that was the brutal introduction to RTA. So I can't remember when that was, but it was way back.
I remember the lunch.
Yeah.
Oh,
Narayan was still with Lynn at the time, so it was a different life. But yeah, we anyways with enough stories. So Narayan, you take it away from here.
Yep. Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yep.
All right. So I'm with Cortera Energy, and I'm going to be talking about best practices for ratio forecasting. It's something that we as a company have been doing on every well for the past 4 years, and we just want to talk about what some of our best practices are, what our biases are, and how we implement it on every well. So why do we need this? It is basically a complementary process for the multi-phase flowing material balance. As you saw in a presentation earlier from Devin, you have a tank, you interpreted an oil in place, you actually interpret a contactor pour volume that you convert to a contactor oil in place and a gas in place. Now, great, you have a tank size. Now you need to get to what is the EUR of the well, and in order to address what is the EUR that's associated with that drainage volume, you need a recovery factor. So the purpose of forecasting ratios is to get to cumulative producing fluid, the fluid ratios at abandonment pressure that you pair with a material balance analysis to get recovery factors, and then you multiply those recovery factors with your estimates of contacted volumes in your drainage tank on a per well basis to get your hydrocarbon EURs. That's why we're talking about forecasting ratios in this particular presentation. The objective is to get EURs. In order to do that, we need to obtain good estimates of cumulative producing fluid ratios at abandonment pressure. For a longer version, and there was a webinar that we did a while ago that you can access, or you can ask Matthias for access. We actually walked through the theory, and for the interest of time, we're not going to walk through the theory. We're going to talk about the practical aspects of applying this method in the real world. However, this webinar should be accessible with the theory behind it. And of course, the brainchild are the who came up with this method are the same two folks who came up with the flowing material balance method. Dr. Thompson and Barry Ruddick. They used to be my colleagues. You can access this link right here. So it's basically a recap of the webinar we did about a year ago. I'm going to go through that same example that I presented at the webinar with a few more interesting details where I dive into that one particular well and walk through our workflow when we do this one particular analysis. So in the webinar, we talked about 4 examples. I'm going to elaborate on a Delaware Basin Wolfcamp gas well. This is a near critical gas condensate well. In the webinar, we talked about multiple different PVT types. So the example we talked about in the Permian Delaware Wolfcamp A well, here's the production data. So what's interesting is what the initial GOR is. Like I said, we classify this as a gas, and we use Whitson Plus for all our PVT characterization. And I'm showing you the production data. You can just look at what the rate versus Q are for the 2 hydrocarbon phases. Just have that in your mind. You can probably draw a line there and kind of have a mental picture for what this well is going to look like in EUR space, because that's where this presentation's headed, trying to get a good estimate for what the EURs are. All right, so this is all extracted from the webinar. Some of the newer slides are coming up shortly. So in the webinar, we talked about how we did a contactor pore volume estimate using the multiphase fluid material balance method. And the caveat when we worked through the first and second webinar was for a gas condensate well, our estimate in absolute sense, when you're looking at only this particular well, our estimate for the contactor pore volume are potentially conservative. So that's one caveat to just keep in mind in the absolute sense when you look at this one particular well. The contactor oil in place is 1.2 million barrels, and the contacted gas in place is roughly 5.2 BCF. All right, great. So now you have the tank. Now let's work through the purpose of the presentation, which is a ratios analysis. And the timestamp at which I did the webinar was when I built the forecast was somewhere mid-2021. You can see that on the bottom left chart. So on the bottom left chart is bottom hole pressure versus time. Top left is OGR versus sand phase pressure. And the top right chart is water gas ratio versus sand phase pressure. And the reason it is water gas ratio is gas is always going to be present. That's going to be a phase that's always available. So what we're going to talk about is what's the shape of these curves and what are we doing here. So as you know, the workflow is going to be basically, you see those points right there, those are digitized. You're going to make a forecast on what the yield is going to do as a function of pressure. And you can notice here, there's a gray set of data points right here. What's displayed on here for this particular well is the RV curve generated from the equation of state, which tells you a bottom end well, the purpose of the RV curve is basically if there is no oil that is mobile in the reservoir, that's the volatilized oil in solution with the gas. So if gas is the only phase that's flowing in the reservoir. So that kind of gives you a bottom end. And what's plotted on here in the green data points is the actual empirical data associated with the well. The blue one associated with the actual empirical data, which is the water gas ratio versus time, and the bottom hole pressure. This particular well has a gauge, so we have pretty good confidence in what our bottom hole pressures are versus time. So what you'll notice right here is we put a forecast on here that basically linearly extrapolates to where the bottom hole pressure is headed. Our abandonment pressure assumption for this particular well was 500 PSI. So that's the important thing. You're forecasting bottom hole pressure versus time. I've just done it very simply using a linear extrapolation. And what's on here is my estimate for yield versus sand phase pressure. And that might be the one of the questions we're trying to answer with this presentation is how do you guys forecast this? Water gas ratio is more of an empirical observation, and gas being always the non-wetting phase. Our empirical observation is water gas ratio is typically declining as a function of sand phase pressure. And I'll also address, hey, how do you forecast this? All right. So when I look at this one particular well, you'll have questions. Hey, if we only had data up to 2000 PSI, it's natural for everyone to ask, hey, if I backtest this process, if I go back to the snapshot in time, would I have built the right forecast? It is plausible that you could have built either the red, the blue, and what I've highlighted right there. Could we have had a priori knowledge how to build that digitized forecast for what yield would have behaved as a function of bottom hole pressure? Again, purpose of this presentation. So let's just walk through physically what's going to happen when you build these three very different forecasts. Let's just get through what would happen when you build these three very different forecasts on OGR. I'm going to do the same on water gas ratio, but towards the end of it, I'll try to convince you that building the most accurate forecast on water gas ratio is less fruitful than perhaps the most impactful variable is going to be the forecast that you build in yield versus sand phase pressure. All right, so what are we physically doing? When we're physically putting a forecast right here, just assume that I linearly extrapolate the red curve versus the blue curve versus what the reality is, which is the green. What you're physically doing is you're taking a bottom hole pressure versus time forecast, pairing it with versus yield versus pressure, converting it to basically a ratio versus time. You have both the series explained in order to convert it to yield versus time. So here's what yield or OGR versus time would have looked like for those three different forecasts. Oops. And from a material balance standpoint, what we care about most is what the cumulative yield looks like versus time for those three different forecasts. So if I had built those three very different forecasts, you'd have ended up with at a snapshot in time, we end up forecasted, let's say 50 years from now, you would end up, or whatever the timestamp here is that I picked, is you'd have ended up with a cumulative yield forecast of 140, 89, 65. So that kind of represents the range of outcomes that would have built for that one particular well if I had no way of knowing how to forecast those wells. For a well that starts off at roughly 250 barrels per million, that's what the range would have been. So what would that translate to in terms of uncertainty in the recovery factors and the yield and the EURs, resulting EURs? That's what the next slide is going to be about. So I'm going to take these three different end member scenarios. I'm going to show you what the uncertainty looks like in terms of EUR and recovery factor. So this is a complicated chart. I'm going to take a minute to explain this. All these numbers are coming again from a simple material balance. I'll explain that also in just a second. So what this curve is basically, the purpose of the curve before we look at the numbers in detail is it's basically a linear relationship. So the ratio forecast that you build and where you're headed in cumulative space at abandonment is a linear relationship to recovery factor and hence a linear relationship to EUR. In other words, if I build a forecast with 65 versus 140, which are these two numbers right here, the impact on the recovery factor is linear, material balance recovery factor, and hence a linear relationship versus EUR. So that's what I'm trying to stress here is a forecast that you need to be paying attention to is the yield versus sand phase pressure. That is the most impactful to your hydrocarbon phase forecast. And it is linear, so there's a simplicity associated with it. If you're off by whatever percentage, you know it's going to be a linear impact on EUR. So that's the mechanics of the forecast. That's what the uncertainty is. And now really what the question is how do you constrain it, which will be coming up in the next two slides. Here's what a forecast looks like for that one particular well. So let's say this forecast is correct. How do you get your forecast at abandonment? It is simply, I'm showing you the outcome of the recovery factor analysis for this particular well. So how do you get your ratios at forecast? This is simple, just divide your EURs. So it would be EUR oil divided by EUR gas. That gives you your OGRP at abandonment. Flip the ratio, you get your GRP at abandonment. Just so we're talking about the same set of numbers, when I use the term OGRP at abandonment, it is the EUR ratios. All right, so we're looking at about a 33% recovery factor, forecasting a 382,000 barrel oil forecast for this one particular well. So how do you QC this? How do you know the curve that you've arbitrarily drawn that makes sense? Well, the first step should be, you see that little highlight right there, which is something that Wits and Plus has added in the UI, which is GOR versus oil. That shows you what a cumulative GOR forecast, if you toggle that option, looks like versus cum oil. This by far is one of the best diagnostics that are available for QCing the yield versus sand phase pressure forecast that you have available. And our general observation from an empirical sense, or when you run numerical models, is going to be you're going to get a linear or a concave upwards forecast. I wish I had the time to go more into the details and the mechanics of it, but I would defer you to Steve Jones' paper, who used to be a colleague of mine, to read. So that is one way to kind of QC it. If you have a rather optimistic forecast on yield versus sand phase pressure, you'll see a concavity downwards, but what you're looking for is the best case scenario is a linear, with more pessimistic versions being like this one particular example, concave upwards. So if I take that one same particular well, there's a misconception as far as, hey, is this completely independent from numerical simulation? And the answer is it's not. If I take this one same particular well and run a numerical simulation model and history match this one particular well, what do I end up with? I end up with an abandonment average reservoir pressure close to 500 PSI, bottom left chart. What my cumulative OGR at the end of history, something close to 88, and a water gas abandonment ratio 350. What's more important is if I use the same numbers that I use in the recovery factor forecast, and I create a simulation model with the same eventual outcome, the recovery factor that you'll get from two different workflows are going to be identical for the hydrocarbon phases. That's really important. This one's slightly different on water because I didn't spend too much time tuning the history match, but the hydrocarbon phase forecast recovery factors are going to be identical that you get from a recovery factor analysis because the equations for material balance for primary drive, expansion drive are mathematically consistent with what you would get from a numerical model. That's an important kind of takeaway that wasn't clear to me initially, but it was clear to me later. So the recovery factors that you get from recovery factor analysis, as long as the abandonment ratios are the same, generated from a numerical model and material balance are going to be identical. So one of the concerns you might hear is these material balance recovery factors are too damn high. Well, here's the explanation for why they're too damn high. One is we typically talk in terms of a recovery factor which has oil in place that's driven from petrophysics in the denominator. UR oil is what we all might agree on. Hey, here's a number that we've sourced. There was a survey that Matthias did in the first version of the consortium where the consensus in the industry is what you see in terms of contacted volumes, either from RTA or whatever method that you use, tends to be less than 50%. We contact less than 50% of what we think is in place. That same factor is applicable to your material balance recovery factor. So in other words, the reason your material balance recovery factors may appear to be too high is because that ratio is applicable to what you contact and also applicable to what your traditional view of a recovery factor is. So that's the reason why when you do a material balance recovery factor seems too high is because you're contacting a smaller portion of the rock than you think is available for you to contact. All right, so empirical forecasting guidelines. Again, you always have reservoir simulation backed up by good PVT. We have a subset of reservoirs in which yield is a strong function of flow and bottom hole pressure. In those, you pretty much just take your analog well and use that. I'll show you an example. And the last one is basins like Delaware Basin and Anadarko Merrimack are good examples where average reservoir pressure in addition to flow and bottom hole pressure seems to have a strong influence on our producing GOR. So our preferred workflow, as I showed you a snapshot earlier, is to plot cumulative GOR versus cumulative oil. So here's that practical example, that particular well that I talked about. How did I sanitize where the cumulative GOR that I forecasted, does that make sense? The process that we employ in-house is we just plot our analogs. And when we plot our analogs, the important thing is the one that we throw in the mix is the parent, because that is the most optimistic GORP forecast that we can build. In other words, the parent well will have a flatter GOR compared to your info well. Another one is the analog of the very same spacing that's available next door. That is a bound, tightly drilled infill in the same vicinity. And here's the forecast that I just built for that one particular well. So that's how we sanitize it. We just look at analogs. We're at that part in our development cycle where we have enough analogs that we should have a pretty good idea of where that GOR is headed. If you do not have that data, then you better resort to numerical simulation to help you guide that forecast. And another key observation that we had generally is where this endpoint is on this one particular chart. In other words, wells per section, drilling intensity has a profound impact, like I've shown here on a parent versus an info. This is the second subset of wells that I talked about earlier, where average reservoir pressure seems to have a big impact on our flowing ratios. Generally, the tighter we drill, the higher the GORP at abandonment tends to be. So it's a good rule of thumb, and it tends to be a linear relationship that we leverage to kind of interpolate and figure out, hey, as I'm trying to build a forecast for a new well that falls somewhere in this space, the chances are I should point it in that one particular direction. And again, another tool that you always have is just take your data set, plot your yield versus sand phase pressure, build a type curve like you would build a decline curve type curve, and use that as a guideline. So these are kind of the practical ways we build our forecasts. I'll mention the same deal for water. I'm plotting, in this case, cumulative water gas ratio versus cumulative water, right? So here's the well in question right here. Point is, how do I build a forecast go forward? Where's that cumulative water gas ratio at abandonment going to look like? That's the question. Well, the good news is you can always sanity check your water EUR using DCA and put a wide range on it. And really, you can be relatively wrong on your cumulative water gas ratio at abandonment. I'm showing you a sensitivity to if I were to build this forecast right here, which is, let's say 500, and I'm building a forecast for where that number 500 is going to decline to. If I'm off say 200 versus 400, the impact on the oil recovery factor from a material balance standpoint is minimal. It does have an impact on the gas phase, though, just to keep in mind. So the purpose of having a really good water gas ratio forecast is if you care about your gas forecast. But if your objective is to get a decent oil forecast, just honestly, for most of our oil wells, we don't pay too much attention to a water gas ratio forecast. We just kind of follow the data. But you have this one plot if you want to fine tune that particular forecast. All right, so here's the summary. In numerical models, which is one way of forecasting these wells, you take your PVT, you take your oil perms, and you make an assumption. You make an assumption about oil perms. You make an assumption about what the geometry and the connectivity of the fracture system is in order to create forecasts for your ratios. What Barry and Leslie did is they circumvented the entire process and said, hey, if you have tons of empirical data, why not just use your PVT bins that you have these wells that are producing from, your spacing and bounding characteristics, and just empirically build your ratio forecasts. So the good news is, if they're consistent, if your ratio forecast, whether you enforce it in a numerical model or your empirical data is guiding you towards the same set of endpoints, the material balance method will give you the same answer as the numerical model. That's all I had.
Perfect, sir. This I wish I had this presentation so I could have sent that to people. The billions of times I've had to answer or try to answer this question, and you did a much better job than me. You know, the recovery factor analysis feature in the software that's linked with the Multiphase FMB that Narayan talked about, and there's also simple material balance and the numerical model. If the QM-GOR is the same in all those different cases, the recovery factor should be the same. It's just Walsh and Lake material balance is accounting. And I've done that check like a billion times, and you can do it yourself. That should be consistent. And just to make that a little bit more specific, if you like, the in the software underflow material balance, there is you do the Multiphase FMB method right here, and then there's recovery factor analysis there that you just go in and you add points like Narayan said here, and you do the same for water, and then you forecast your pressure here. So let's say something like this, and then you run it. So that's that guy. The other one is related to the so-called simple material balance down here. That's the same thing. The only difference is that you provide a abandonment pressure, a little bit unsure about the fluid here, and then some kind of cumulative GOR. Maybe this is too low, and you get some recovery factors out there. And that's, again, this recovery factors in the contactor pore volume. Basically, what you're assuming here is that in whatever you're contacting, you're getting the abandonment pressure all the way down to 1,000 psi in this case. But this feature right here, the feature right here with the numerical model, if you do the same work, the recovery factors you get in these boxes right here, and the recovery factors that you get in this feature right here, if the QM-GOR at the end of history is the same, then these recovery factors should also be the same. And I know a lot of people in the call era, we've done those exercises together as well, but just a little FYI. Before we do the next presentation, I saw there was a question there, and you answered it in the chat there, Narayan. But question from Ale: your linear relationship is because you're assuming solution gas drive mechanism as the main drive. So and you said yes, that's correct. So I don't think we need any. But anything else to add there, Narayan?
No, and really, I forgot to mention one thing. One of the benefits of this one particular workflow is you don't need a simulation background to convert your in-place to EUR. So most of our asset engineers, it's fast enough that most of our asset engineers get a chance to do it on every well, and that's important.
Yeah, very good, very good. So with that, I now have my use case that I can send to people, but really good, Narayan. We're going to jump to the second last presentation. So we switched Jason and Ale because Ale said that the best things is at the end or something. No, he had some work commitments. We didn't want to jeopardize Ale's presentation, so we did that as the last presentation, and we're doing Jason's presentation right now. What we're really excited about when it comes to this presentation is a lot of you are doing the API integration now. Then the API, it's not liquid API gravity or API numbers on your wall. That's a short for application programming interface. So that's a way for how you can programmatically interact with Simplus. And it's extremely flexible. You can almost talk about that as its own product. It has like bi-weekly releases. It has its own kind of like product champion, which is JSON, and that's one of these two options on how we can get automatic production data into the tool. So Jason is essentially going to show you how to do this programmatically with code, and he's going to show you how that relates to Wisdom Plus. So with that, Jason, I'll just give the stage to you.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Matthias. Does my sound come through all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. So up until yesterday, I thought this presentation is on Friday. So I was taking my time. I didn't really bother looking at it. And up until I was told this is today, now I start rushing through things. And to my surprise, it's surprisingly easy to put this together. I was able to put together this in half of a day. So this really proves that how much work we've done to make the API better for the past year. And if I can do it in half a day, everyone can do it in half a day. So the outline, so the format of this presentation is given in Jupyter Notebook. And if any of you are familiar with Python, you probably have touched Jupyter Notebook at a certain point. It's an application that within the Python ecosystem that make writing code a lot easier, especially when you're doing experimentation. And also makes presentation a lot easier since you can write a lot of the notes in between different code. So for the purpose of this presentation, so the first, we're going to use the internal wisdom domain. This is what we use internally to do all sorts of experimentations and testings. And also, there are a lot of the APIs that we wrapped it around with different functions. If you just take a detailed look at those functions, they all look very, very similar. All the differences it makes is just they're pinning different URLs, which are listed in the API documentation. So going back to this Jupyter Notebook, the outline of the presentation. So first, we're going to create a project, and then we're going to create a well within the newly created project. And then we're going to upload production data, and we're going to change the PVT data of the default configurations for this well. And we're going to upload wellbore data. And then last, we will run the BHP calculation of the well. And throughout this entire process, we're not going to touch the web application at all. We're just going to use the APIs to construct this entire workflow. So first of all, from this list of equations that we constructed, that is using the APIs, we just import them into this Jupyter Notebook. Pretty standard process. So I already requested a token, and then I set this token as the environment variable. So right here, I'm just getting this token. So the access token is what you use to authenticate the APIs. Because your API is publicly available, to access them, it requires this access token. And this access token is this JWT encoded, looking like some sort of a gibberish if you take a direct look at it. And this is only valid for 24 hours, and it will rotate, and you have to request a new token after it expires. And all this is just measurements that were taken to make sure that it is secure enough that only you can access the database that you want to access for your Wisdom Plus application. So the first, we're going to create a project. So to create a project, we need to know what field that we're going to want to create this project in. So for this presentation that we created this field called knowledge share 2. We come into this field, and then we see there's a default project over here. So now we want to create a new project. And the thing that's required is the field ID. And if we come into this documentation, then we'll see over here, this is upload new project to the field specified by field ID. Nothing is required except for field ID. So there are a couple different ways to get a field ID. So first, we can use get endpoints to retrieve a complete list of all fields, and then along with the sample payload, we will get this ID. Another way to get a field ID is we come into the application, and then we'll look at the URL, and we see the number 74 right after field. And so that number 74, that's our field ID. So we're going to set the field ID here, and then we're going to use this function to create a project. And this function requires the access token, and then the field ID, and then payload, which is what we're gonna the parameters that's specified for the project. The name of the project is test project. Owner is me. We're gonna make this project company-wide, and then the note is this is an external API integration, and we don't want anyone else to touch it. And here we go. So now we come into the application. Let's refresh it. So one thing about using the API is that whenever a data is uploaded through API, it goes directly to the database without touching any of the front end. So the front end don't necessarily know there's new data in the database. So it won't show up unless you go refresh the web URL. Go refresh the website. And whenever you refresh it, the website will pull data from the database directly, and then thus all the new data that you just feeded will be shown in the website. So always refresh after you upload or delete new data from the from your database. So now we see this project is created, and then we come in here, there's nothing. So the next part is we're gonna get a project ID of this project, of this newly created project. So the same as with the field ID, there are two different ways of going to get this ID. The first is we can come in here, we take a look. Sitting in this project, right after projects, there is this number 478, which will be our project ID for this newly created project. And but what we're gonna do is going with the second different method, which is we use the API to fetch this ID. So using this URL, this API, we will get all the projects that's listed under a field. And we come in here, we know our field ID already, the 74, and then we're just gonna get all the projects within there. And then within all the project, we're just gonna filter them until we get the name of the project that's the same as the project we just created. And then that will be our project ID. And that's 478. And come here, that's the same number. Okay, now we have a project. We will create a new one. So for this example over here, extracted from one of the SPE data sets, you can find that in our mass upload template. So I pretty much just copied everything down here. And we will use this function to create a new well. See, let's go into the application, refresh. And now we see this well inside of the project we just created. Come into here, so you will find there's no production data. All the PVT data is by default. It's 1,000 GOR, and everything else is by default number. And see, in the wellbore configuration, the deviation survey is by default, perforations by default, and then the casing tubing, they're all by default. So we will change those numbers later. But before doing that, we will need to get this ID of this newly created well. So in the same fashion we did with project ID, we're gonna use an endpoint to retrieve this. And we see this ID of the well we created is 31742. And if we come into this application, we will find this in the URL as well. Next step is we want to upload production data. And so because production data is way longer and I don't really want you to see all this nonsense, I'll just read the data from a file. And this is an example, just part of a snippet of this production data. It's pretty standard. It's just a list of JSON. And I'm reading it from here, and then I am changing the name of the well into the well ID, and then I will upload this production to each well. And done. Now it's let's come into the web application, and then we refresh it again. And now we see the production data in here. So now we have production data, and we gonna go change the initial GOR. So before that, we saw that in the default GOR that comes into with as well is a 1,000. That's because we don't have any initial GOR data. But now we have the production data. We can estimate that by taking the average of the average GOR of the first 20 days. So coming to here, we will get the production data from the well, and then so we're gonna sort the production by state, and then we're gonna get the first 20 days the GOR, and then we're just gonna add them up and take the average of the first 20. And then now we see that the initial GOR for the first 20 days is 340, which is not, if we come here into the plot and then just take a look at the GOR, which is the purple line right here, that one can see, yeah, that's roughly right. And so the default GOR 1000 is certainly not right. So we're gonna change that. And so initial GOR is 340, and then we're just gonna feed this variable directly into the payload. And then for the PVT method, we're just gonna use GOR only method. And then we will change that using this endpoint. So once the PVT data is changed for a while, it will automatically trigger a composition calc. And then now we come into here, and then you see there's the phase envelope, and see the GOR is changed. There we have phase envelope, we have the black oil table, and so it's ready for further analysis. So now we get into the last section, which is gonna upload the wellbore data, and then we're gonna run a BHP calculation. So the first, we're gonna upload the well deviation surveys. So similar to what we did with the production data, we're reading the deviation surveys from a list of deviation points, with just measurement, the measured depth and then true vertical depth. And we're gonna read it from here and then upload that. Come to the application. Then if we refresh, And then we see all the deviation surveys. And then coming here, that shows perforated intervals, and then good. Now we have the deviation survey. We will change or upload the wellbore configuration data. And for the purpose of this exercise, we're just gonna upload one wellbore configuration with one tubing and then 2 casing segments. And then now we upload that. Come in here, there's nothing, we need to refresh. And now we see there's the new wellbore configuration, which is fed. Okay, the last part, we're just gonna run the BHP calculation on as well. And this is a really simple endpoint. All we need to give is the well ID, which we just extracted earlier, this number 31742. And successfully run BHP calc. Come back in here, refresh it, and we'll probably will find that calculations in motion. Oh, it's already done. Wow, that's a lot faster than I thought. Okay, I think this is all I have. And so everything that we talked about and then all the code I've shown here, you can find that in our manual. And if you go into the API connection, and you will see there's a demo workflow, and you can come in here. All the functions that I use here, you can find in this use endpoints as functions module. And anything that's shown as different sections of the notebook, that you can find that in the blocks within this table of contents here. And I hope this is helpful to you all. Whether you want to start this process within your company or you want to take a try yourself, get into the world of Python and then RESTful APIs. Yeah, please give it a try and then let us know how it works for you and how it can improve your workflow. Thank you for your time.
Awesome, man. It looks like you know, I'll say simple enough even for me to do. But it was cool to see how the code interact with the software and stuff. And of course, on all these intersections, when he's like pulling production data, obviously that you know, in a real life case, you pull that from just a database. When it comes to you know, pulling well IDs and project IDs and these things, they can be 100% automated. The same with accessing like an access token on a daily basis. So all these things can be 100% automated, and it's what most of you guys are doing already. So this is you know, kind of to have a use case of how you can do it. And also if the company that you're in has just been onboarded, you can see some of the potential at least of full automation here. Yeah, so question I guess here, Jason, have you, if you have a notebook built to extract data, that would be highly appreciated. So that's a little feature request that comes from Narayan here, but else with that, I'll just because of time, probably introduce the next speaker, Jason.
Yeah, sounds good.
Really good, thank you a lot. The last presentation today is back to kind of a reservoir subsurface / economics presentation. Is a presentation from Chevron, where I'll always kind of present a kind of a workflow that I did to back up some economic decisions in the DJ Basin. You know, when I met him the first time, I can't remember when that was, but I think it was Utek during COVID for the first time. Since then, we've been chatting a lot, become good friends. He's now up in Denver, working out of the Denver office there. And he will start to present here really soon. So with that.